Hey guys. Tonight we begin with the floating nightmares, the Victorians politely called prison hulks. Giant wooden ghosts chained in the harbor, packed with convicts the government did not quite know what to do with. You stand on the deck, the air thick with tar, damp wood, and the kind of silence that means someone is definitely regretting their life choices. Lamps flicker, irons clink, and the tide keeps tapping the hull like it is trying to warn you about something. These ships were never meant to carry people for years, yet here you are, stepping into a world that smells like salt, sweat, and questionable decisions. So before you get too cozy, take a second to gently tap that new hype button YouTube just added. It really does help little guys like me push through the algorithm, and be sure to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of quiet storytelling. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to know who else is drifting off with us around the world. Now, get comfortable, let the day melt away, and we'll drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. You step onto the gangway, the old planks bending beneath your boots like they are already tired of your existence. The ship looms above you, a hulking mass of rotting timbers and peeling tar, groaning softly as if complaining about its new load of human problems. The line behind you shuffles forward, chains clinking in an uneven rhythm that sounds almost musical if you ignore the part where you are one of the instruments. The guards bark orders with the enthusiasm of men who stopped enjoying their jobs sometime around never, and you do your best to look compliant without looking terrified, which is harder than you expect. The smell hits next, a swirling cocktail of salt water, stale sweat, damp wood, and whatever dreams gave up down here decades ago. It creeps into your nose, wraps itself around your tongue, and settles in your hair like it has every intention of staying. You breathe shallowly at first, then reluctantly accept that air is not optional. The guards march you forward with the practiced boredom of people who have seen this scene so many times they could do it asleep, though you suspect some actually have. You step fully onto the deck, and the ship gives a long, low groan that sounds like it is judging you personally. Lanterns sway from hooks, their light trembling across warped planks and rusting fittings. Every creak feels like a warning, the sort of sound that says, this vessel once sailed proudly into battle and now resents being used as a floating storage box for society's unwanted. The paint has long surrendered, replaced by layers of grime, patches of rot, and carvings left behind by men with too many hours and too few coping mechanisms. Someone scratched a prayer into the rail, someone else carved a name, and someone else tried to draw a bird but gave up halfway, which feels painfully relatable. The guards herd you toward the center of the deck. One of them taps a ledger with a small flourish, the closest thing to artistry you have ever seen in paperwork. He looks you up and down as though assessing whether you will survive a week, then jots something down with the confidence of a man who believes he is never wrong. You try to read his face, to guess if he sees defiance or fear in your eyes, but he gives you the same look he gives everyone, the look of a man mentally categorizing livestock. Chains ring out around you, harsh at first, then gradually blending into the background until you barely hear them. The men beside you wear irons that glint dully in the lantern light, each link heavy enough to remind them of exactly where they stand. You can feel the ship tilting ever so slightly, bobbing with the harbor's slow pulse, and your stomach sways with it. One of the prisoners behind you mutters something that sounds like a prayer mixed with a complaint, which may be the most honest genre of communication on this vessel. A cold breeze snakes across the deck and slips under your collar, carrying with it the distant scent of shore. Somewhere out there, normal life continues. People buy bread, gossip with neighbors, and complain about weather instead of the structural integrity of their living quarters. You try to picture it, but the image feels fuzzy, like a memory borrowed from someone else. The hulk has its own gravity, pulling you inward, demanding you acknowledge that the rules have changed. You glance up. Above you is a tangle of rigging that no longer leads anywhere. Sails have been stripped away, leaving ropes that swayed gently in the night breeze like the world's saddest wind chimes. Seagulls perch there, watching you with the confidence of creatures who know they will outlive you. One squawks loudly, a sound so sharp it makes a few prisoners flinch. The bird tilts its head as if amused, then settles back down, unbothered by human suffering, which seems to be a recurring theme here. A guard yells for everyone to move, and you are pushed toward a hatch that looks too small for comfort and too dark for sanity. You hesitate at the threshold, staring down into a gloom that smells thick and alive. Warm, humid air rises from below, carrying hints of bodies, damp rope, and the slow decay of wood that has absorbed too many secrets. The lantern beside the hatch flickers weakly, barely pushing back the dark. This is the moment the truth settles in your bones, heavier than the irons you will soon wear. This ship was built for battles, storms, and cannon fire, not for housing, breathing, coughing, endlessly sweating humans. It has been forced into this life just as you have, repurposed into something neither of you were meant to be. You grip the ladder, feel the rough wood under your fingers, and begin your descent into the belly of the hulk, the sound of chains echoing behind you like the first notes of a long, unwelcomed song. You learn what the ship truly is before you even finish your first stumbling steps along the dim lower deck. A guard with a voice like gravel announces it proudly, as though the news should comfort you. This is not a warship anymore. It is a prison hulk, a floating warehouse for convicts, a solution cooked up by a government running low on space, patience, and apparently architectural creativity. The guard explains it with the casual tone of someone describing a harmless public works project instead of a human filing cabinet. You listen because you have no choice, but also because you want to know how anyone convinced themselves this was a good idea. The Victorians, in their earnest obsession with order and progress, took one look at overflowing land prisons and another at rotting ships left over from past naval glory, then clapped their hands together like children discovering building blocks. Why construct new prisons when they already had giant wooden shells sitting around, perfectly capable of holding as many miserable people as the crown required? Never mind that these ships were built to chase French fleets across the sea, not hold convicts who needed sleep, food, and air that did not taste like soaked timber. The officials in London wrote neat reports insisting these hulks were temporary, reasonable, and humane. You stand in the dark belly of this ship and wonder how much ink they had to spill to make that sound convincing. The guard goes on, clearly enjoying his role as tour guide to despair. The hulks are efficient, he claims. They keep convicts far from the innocent public. They offer useful labor. They repurpose resources. He lists these points as if reciting scripture, leaving out the part where the ships sit in stagnant harbors for years, gathering mold, illness, and men who slowly forget what the sky looks like without bars in the way. You picture a line of powdered bureaucrats nodding at each other across polished tables, congratulating themselves for solving a crisis with majestic frugality. If any of them stepped foot on board, they would probably faint before reaching the lower deck. You walk deeper, stepping through shadows that stick to the beams like old stains. The wooden ribs of the ship arch above you, coated with decades of tar, sweat, and whatever fuel keeps misery burning. Every plank whispers a little history. Once this vessel carried cannons, gunpowder, and sailors who dreamed of glory, or at least a warm meal. Now it carries men in irons, stacked in tiers tighter than cargo. You imagine the ship sighing under the weight of this new purpose, wondering where everything went wrong, much like the men it now imprisons. Another guard explains the logic as if reading aloud from a manual written by someone who has never met another human. Hulks prevent escape because the surrounding water does the job for them. Hulks save money because they need no land. Hulks discourage crime because no one wants to end up on one. You stare at him, then look around at the dozens of prisoners packed shoulder to shoulder like an oddly surly collection of sardines, and think the government might have overestimated the deterrent effect. A few crimes might even be worth it compared to this. You ask nothing aloud because speaking invites attention, and attention on a prison hulk is rarely a prize. Instead, you absorb the information silently, letting it settle like dust in your lungs. This place exists because someone somewhere believed misery would build discipline, because someone else agreed, and because no one who mattered had to live here. And once the idea took hold, it spread faster than common sense ever could. As you continue forward, the ship rocks lightly, the water slapping the hull with soft indifference. The sound should be calming, but it only reminds you that there is no escape except through the harbor's cold embrace. You overhear another prisoner whispering to a newcomer that the hulks were supposed to be temporary, a stopgap until more prisons could be built. That was decades ago. Governments love the word temporary when it conveniently lasts long enough for everyone involved to retire. You move along the narrow passage and pass a small window cut into the hull. It offers a glimpse of the shore, distant and ordinary, filled with people who have never smelled this suffocating blend of damp wood and confinement. The guards insist the hulks are necessary, a cornerstone of justice, an innovative response to crime. You wonder if any of those men on shore ever think about the difference between necessity and convenience. By the time you finish the forced tour, you understand the truth clearly. This ship floats not because it is seaworthy, but because it is cheaper to let it rot slowly than to dismantle it. The government calls it progress. You call it something else entirely. You grip the edge of the hatch and take your first cautious step downward, the ladder groaning beneath your weight, as if warning you to turn back. The lantern above casts a thin, trembling glow that barely reaches the first few rungs, and everything below that point falls into a murky blur of shadows and damp wood. The smell intensifies immediately, thick and warm, like breathing through a blanket that someone forgot to wash for a decade. You try to inhale lightly, but the air pushes back, heavy with moisture and the collective exhale of too many bodies crammed into too little space. Each rung brings you closer to the heart of the ship, and with every foot you descend, you understand a little more why the men around you look like they are always negotiating with their own lungs. Your boots touch the lower deck, and the boards answer with a hollow thud. The lanterns here are spaced far apart, their light pale and exhausted, barely strong enough to carve narrow cones of visibility out of the gloom. Most of the deck lies in shadow, shifting shapes and silhouettes that move when men cough or turn in their sleep. The air feels trapped, like it has been passed around too many times and finally given up. Heat gathers low to the ground, hugging your ankles before slithering up your legs and settling in your chest. Breathing becomes a deliberate act, something you must remember to do rather than something your body offers freely. You take a few steps forward, and the ship creaks underfoot with long, mournful sighs. The sound vibrates through your bones, an old voice complaining about the constant burden of human presence. Your eyes adjust slowly, revealing rows of wooden platforms stacked on either side of the deck. These bunks are barely large enough for a man to lie still, and most of the occupants look as though they are afraid to move for fear of waking someone or cracking their heads on the beams above them. The prisoners lie shoulder to shoulder in a cramped arrangement that would make sardines protest. As you walk deeper, the floorboards become slick with condensation and something you choose not to identify. You slip slightly, catching yourself on a beam that feels damp and warm to the touch. Somewhere nearby, someone wheezes in a long, rattling rhythm that makes you wonder if the ship itself is trying to breathe through him. A few men glance your way, their eyes dull but observant, measuring you with the slow calculation of people who have seen dozens of newcomers arrive and change absolutely nothing. No one speaks at first. Down here, silence carries more weight than noise, and breaking it feels like stepping on sacred ground. When someone finally does speak, it is a whisper drifting out of the shadows. You turn to see an older convict, sitting cross-legged on his bunk, chains pooled at his feet like a nest of metal snakes. He gestures vaguely at the air and tells you it never gets better. The lungs adjust, he says, or they surrender. He cannot remember which happens first, but he insists it hardly matters. His voice holds the calm certainty of a man who has been down here far too long. You want to ask how many years, but the question sticks in your throat, weighted down by the heavy atmosphere. A guard passes through the row with a lantern, and the sudden flare of orange light reveals the crowded reality you heard about only in murmurs. Faces, dozens of them, watching from bunks like pale moons, drifting in a fog of stale breath. The light glints off chains, off sweat, off the condensation clinging to the ceiling. The guard mutters about the heat building again, wipes his brow with a sleeve, then continues on his path without acknowledging a single human being. He is used to the air, or perhaps he has given up bargaining with it. Someone coughs behind you, a deep, chest-shaking sound that echoes through the hull. It triggers another cough, then another, and soon half the deck is caught in a chorus of hacking that makes the lanterns tremble. When the coughing dies down, the silence that follows feels even heavier, like the ship is holding its breath, waiting to see who will inhale next. You take one more step, steadying yourself as the floor shifts beneath you. The ceiling hangs low, beams crowding overhead, as if the ship itself is closing in. You feel your lungs strain, searching for air that does not taste like damp wood and human struggle. For a moment, you understand why the prisoner's shoulders sag the way they do, why their eyes look hollow, why every movement feels like it must be justified to the body before being attempted. Down here, even oxygen comes at a cost. You move deeper into the dim belly of the hulk, each step announcing itself with a creak that feels louder than it should. The lantern light fades behind you until the world becomes a shifting blend of shadows, whispers, and the faint clink of iron against iron. You sense eyes on you long before you can see faces, the way animals sense a change in weather. And when the shapes around you finally sharpen into men, it is like walking into a room full of ghosts who never quite finish their business with the world. The first prisoner you truly see sits on the edge of his bunk, elbows on knees, looking at you with the mild interest of someone evaluating whether you will make decent conversation or at least amusing background scenery. His face is a map of old scrapes and poorly healed cuts, each line telling its own version of events he has probably edited for dramatic effect. He greets you with a nod that seems almost friendly until you realize he is watching your pockets, not your eyes. Down here, hospitality is more curiosity than kindness. Still, he offers a grin, a crooked thing that looks like it has survived more than a few fights, and you give a cautious nod in return because refusing might count as arrogance. And arrogance, you suspect, has consequences. A few bunks away, another man lies back with his arms folded behind his head, staring at you as if he is judging your posture, your breathing, or possibly your entire life trajectory. He looks young but worn, the kind of face that might have been charming before the world took a turn and knocked the charm clean off. He asks your crime without ceremony. When you hesitate, he fills the silence with his own story, explaining how he was accused of stealing something he insists he never touched, unless you count looking at it too long. Around him, a few prisoners snicker, not because they doubt his innocence, but because innocence is a fragile currency on this ship, and no one here is wealthy. Further down the row sits the quiet one, a man carved from stillness, eyes dark and heavy, hands chained neatly in front of him like he is attending a sermon designed for the hopeless. He watches you steadily, his expression unreadable, as though he is trying to decide whether you are harmless, troublesome, or simply passing through like every miserable soul before you. When someone nearby nudges him and cracks a joke, he answers with a single sigh that says he has heard it all before and found none of it particularly enlightening. You soon learn that the prisoners communicate with a rhythm unique to men who share too much space and too little hope. Their humor is sharp, dry, and often delivered with the straightest of faces. A man with a missing tooth tells you he lost it in a bar fight defending his honor, only for the older prisoner beside him to snort and reveal he lost it to a loaf of stale bread. Another man proudly lifts his shirt to show a scar twisting across his ribs like a restless snake. He claims it came from a duel. His bunkmate corrects him, saying it came from slipping on fish guts at the docks. The duel version wins more admiration, so the fish narrative is quickly forgotten. You meet the storyteller next, a wiry fellow with eyes too bright for this place. He speaks with the energy of a man determined to keep his mind moving faster than his circumstances. He tells tales of distant towns, crooked constables, and a cousin who supposedly wrestled a bull, though everyone within earshot insists the cousin barely managed a goat. His stories draw men closer, not because anyone believes them, but because they provide a brief vacation from the ship's heavy air. Then there is the man they call preacher, though you doubt any official church would claim him. He quotes scripture with the enthusiasm of someone mixing holy text with personal opinions, occasionally inserting words that definitely do not appear in any Bible you have ever heard of. He means well, the men say, though they say it with a tone that implies meaning well is frequently inconvenient. What strikes you most is how these men talk to each other, blending mockery with a strange kind of solidarity. They tease, argue, and embellish their pasts, yet beneath all of it lies a thread of unspoken understanding. Every man here has been dragged by life, tossed in a direction he never planned, and pinned to this floating carcass of a ship. They know suffering intimately, and they meet it with humor, because humor is the only thing that has not yet been confiscated. One man pats the bunk beside him and tells you that everyone down here carries a story, though some stories grow taller with every telling. Another laughs and says, stories cost nothing, but believing them might. You realize then that meeting the prisoners is less about learning who they were and more about understanding who they have had to become. These are men forged by misfortune, bound together by chains, and kept alive by jokes sharper than the blades they are forbidden to carry. You begin to understand the rules long before anyone explains them, because the ship does not waste time with formal introductions. The hierarchy reveals itself in the way men move, how they sit, who talks first, and who does not bother talking at all. It is not written anywhere, yet it feels as solid as the timbers pressing in around you. You watch, and you listen, and the ship teaches you its lessons faster than any guard ever could. The first rule becomes obvious the moment you enter the main sleeping deck. There are certain bunks you do not look at too long, certain corners you do not wander into unless you want your day to end badly. A man near the center row sits with his back against the wall, chains resting on his lap like a pet he has trained. Nobody steps within arm's reach of him unless invited, and he pays for nothing in the quiet currency of favors. You learn his name quickly, because others say it with the same caution you might use around a loose cannon rolling across a deck. He does not raise his voice. He does not need to. The space shifts around him like the ship itself gives him a polite berth. Then there is the man everyone calls cook, though he does not cook anything. He simply stands closest to the food bucket when it arrives and has declared himself in charge of distribution. The guards have not bothered correcting this situation. Perhaps they think it builds character, or perhaps they just enjoy watching men negotiate spoonfuls of stew with all the diplomacy of treaty talks. Cook is not dangerous in the dramatic sense. He is dangerous in the petty sense, the way an annoyed rooster is dangerous. Annoy him and you will find your portion shrinking mysteriously or your bowl tilting at just the wrong moment. You conclude quickly that appeasing him is cheaper than challenging him. At the far end of the deck sits a man who does not speak, not because he lacks words, but because he has discovered silence is the most effective tool available. He watches everything, eyes following movements with unsettling patience. When he stands, others shift. When he sits, the air loosens slightly. You are not sure whether to fear him or admire him, but you are certain not to sit on his bunk, lean on his beam, or exist in his immediate vicinity without good reason. Between these pillars of authority are the men who orbit them, forming the layers of the ship's social structure. Some serve as messengers, carrying whispers between bunks with the urgency of men passing state secrets. Others handle disputes, though their method of conflict resolution usually involves deciding who looks more tired and assigning blame accordingly. None of them wear badges or hold titles. They earn their positions through time, cunning, or the sort of stubbornness that convinces others to leave them alone. You quickly learn that humor here is a territory of its own. A sharp joke can earn respect, but misjudge your audience, and you may find a spoon pointed at your ribs with surprising conviction. One prisoner explains this while demonstrating the exact grip one should fear. He insists he is only showing you for educational purposes, which does not make you feel any better. There is also the unspoken rule about noise. Loudness is tolerated only in specific windows of the day, usually when the guards shuffle about pretending they are maintaining order. At night, when the lanterns burn low and the air turns thick, the men grow quieter, voices dropping into murmurs. If someone breaks that quiet, the entire deck shifts in irritation, and the offender is encouraged to reconsider his choices through a series of pointed glares and, occasionally, a strategic elbow. One afternoon, you witness a small skirmish that teaches you another rule. A newcomer accidentally sits where he should not, directly on the edge of a bunk belonging to a man with eyebrows that practically warn strangers to keep their distance. The offender stands quickly, mutters an apology, and backs away. Eyebrows only stares. The tension lasts several breaths before melting into nothing, but you can feel the lesson sink into your spine. The men here do not need weapons. They have mastered the art of making a look feel like a threat. Gradually, you begin to understand where you fit. Not important enough to draw attention, not foolish enough to provoke anyone, not yet knowledgeable enough to navigate the subtler politics. You stand on the outer edge of things, which is the safest place for anyone new. From there, you observe, you catalog. You learn which men laugh too easily, which hide anger beneath quiet tones, and which will defend you simply because they are bored and enjoy watching chaos unfold. The ship has its own ecosystem, a living hierarchy crafted from boredom, confinement, and too many personalities pressed into the same wooden box. You adapt because adaptation feels easier than the alternative. The rules do not make sense in the outside world, but down here they fit perfectly, like the ship has shaped them through years of tension and forced cooperation. And by the time you realize you are following these rules instinctively, the ship has already claimed another part of you. You climb into your berth with the optimism of someone who still believes sleep is possible in a place like this. The bunk is little more than a plank hammered into the ship's ribs, narrow enough that turning over feels like an advanced gymnastic maneuver. The boards sag beneath you in a way that suggests they were never meant to support human weight, and they complain loudly as if personally offended by your presence. You settle onto your back, staring at the low beams above you, and immediately feel the wood press into your spine with the tenderness of a reprimand. Around you, the lower deck shifts into its nighttime chorus. Bodies rustle in their chains, someone coughs in long, dramatic bursts, and the man 2 bunks away snores. With such commitment, you wonder if he has been hired by the ocean to communicate with submerged creatures. Each inhale sounds like a wave curling, each exhale like a dying foghorn. You try to ignore him, but the rhythm grows hypnotic, vibrating through the wooden planks and into your ribs until you swear you can feel the snores echo behind your teeth. The heat gathers quickly. The air does not move so much as settle, warm and stale, like it has been used too many times before reaching your lungs. You shift slightly, trying to create a pocket of cooler space under your blanket. But any movement sends another series of squeaks from the boards that feel loud enough to alert the guards. Someone grumbles from the row across, as if your attempt at comfort has personally disturbed his moral peace. You try lying on your side. You immediately encounter the wall, a curved plank that presses against your shoulder as though encouraging you to consider a different orientation. Lying on your other side is no better, because it brings you dangerously close to the edge, and falling out of your bunk would be the sort of event the other prisoners would discuss for weeks. You lie still, holding your breath for a moment as if silence might trick your body into slipping into rest. It does not. A man somewhere in the dark begins muttering in his sleep, arguing with someone only he can see. Another prisoner answers with a sleepy curse. The bunks sway gently with the tide, each movement sending a soft creak through the deck that blends with the distant slap of water against the hull. You close your eyes and try to imagine being anywhere else, but the ship has a way of reminding you exactly where you are. A drop of condensation lands on your forehead, cold and indifferent, proof that even the ceiling is participating in the general discomfort. Your legs begin to cramp from the tight space, and you stretch them just an inch. This is a mistake. Your foot knocks the chain hanging near the foot of your bunk, and it rattles loudly enough to make someone grunt in annoyance. You whisper an apology out of instinct, though you are not entirely sure to whom you are apologizing. The snoring continues, unwavering, a confident performance that suggests the man has never known shame. Eventually, your thoughts drift as the noises blend into a single, relentless hum. You become aware of the smell rising from the bunks below, a mix of damp clothing, sweat, and old wood that has soaked up more history than any living creature. It clings to you, settling in your hair, your shirt, your very sense of identity. You inhale cautiously, wishing for a breeze, a window, a merciful change in the atmosphere. But the air remains stubbornly thick. Someone shifts in the bunk beneath you, and the whole structure vibrates. For a moment you think the ship itself might inhale, the way it groans and settles. You almost believe the hulk is alive, and that it resents being used as a floating hive of restless men. You would resent it too if you were in its position. You close your eyes again and focus on the rhythm around you, the rolling tide, the chains settling, the distant voices of men trying to will themselves into sleep. The snores become background noise. The discomfort becomes familiar, and the warmth becomes something you can almost tolerate. Eventually, slowly, reluctantly, your body surrenders. Sleep here is not restful. It is something you fall into the way a man might fall into a shallow puddle, still aware of the ground beneath him, still aware that he does not belong where he is, but it comes. And on a Victorian prison hulk, that counts as a small victory. The morning begins with a clang that jolts the entire lower deck awake, a metallic announcement that food is coming, though calling it food feels ambitious. Men stir in their bunks, rubbing their eyes, stretching limbs stiffened by the night's cramped sleep, and preparing themselves for the daily ritual known as breakfast, though nothing about it resembles anything you once associated with that word. You follow the crowd as it forms a loose line, more of a resigned shuffle than an orderly queue, each man moving with the determination of someone who knows the alternative is leaving the meal to the rats, who already act like paying tenants. The first thing you see is the bucket. The second thing you see is the man stirring it with a ladle that looks like it should have been retired during the previous century. The mixture inside sloshes slowly, a grayish broth with floating shapes you decide not to analyze too closely. Steam rises with a wavering uncertainty, as if even the heat is not fully committed to being here. The smell is a blend of salt, old barley, and the general mood of disappointment. The cook, self-declared and entirely unchallenged in his position, dips the ladle with a theatrical sigh, as though feeding dozens of men this masterpiece is a burden he alone carries with dignity. When your turn arrives, he eyes your bowl, then your face, then your bowl again, performing an assessment whose criteria remain a mystery. His ladle hovers, dripping a trail of liquid that hits the deck with soft splashes. Finally, he pours a portion of the slop into your bowl with a flourish that suggests generosity, though the serving barely covers the bottom. You murmur something resembling thanks, because you have not yet learned that gratitude is not the expected reaction here, and the cook raises a single eyebrow like you have just committed a breach of etiquette. You step aside and survey your portion. The broth has a faint sheen on top, shimmering like a tiny polluted pond. A few suspicious grains drift lazily, as if contemplating escape. You lift the bowl cautiously and take your first sip. The salt hits immediately, overwhelming everything else, as though someone had attempted to preserve the broth for a journey across the entire globe. Beneath the salt is a thin, watery bitterness that suggests vegetables were once involved in the preparation process, perhaps as witnesses rather than ingredients. You pause, trying to decide if it is edible or merely technically so. Around you, men gulp it down quickly, not because they enjoy it, but because hesitation invites disappointment. After the broth comes the bread, distributed in chunks that bear a closer resemblance to building materials than nourishment. A guard drops a piece into your hand with a thud that resonates through your palm. The crust is so hard, you briefly consider using it to carve your name into the timber. The interior is only marginally softer, dense, and pale, smelling faintly of yeast and mostly of compromise. You bite into it with caution and feel your jaw protest, as though it has not signed up for this level of commitment. The bread absorbs the broth well enough, acting like a sponge that has seen some things and refuses to discuss them. The men around you eat in practiced silence, focused on the task of getting the meal down before their stomachs rethink the plan. A few trade comments under their breath, dry jokes about the culinary creativity of the British penal system. One man claims the bread could stop a musket shot at close range. Another insists that if the ship ever sinks, the prisoners could fashion a raft from the hardened loaves and drift to freedom, assuming the waves respect baked goods. The laughter that follows is brief but genuine, a flicker of shared survival instinct wrapped in humor. As you chew, you notice that the broth's aftertaste lingers, faintly metallic, like the flavor of old kettles boiled too many times. You swallow again quickly, hoping momentum will carry you through the rest. The warmth of the liquid spreads through you in spite of its flaws, and you remind yourself that warmth is a luxury on this ship, even if it arrives disguised as questionable soup. When the meal ends, bowls are stacked, crumbs are brushed away, and the cook resumes, stirring the remainder of the bucket with the solemn air of a man tending a sacred ritual. Men drift back to their tasks, their bunks, or simply to find a patch of deck that feels slightly less miserable than the rest. You linger a moment longer, examining the bread crust still in your hand, marveling at its stubborn texture. It strikes you then that this meal, as strange and unappealing as it is, will become part of your daily rhythm. You will drink the salted nonsense until your tongue accepts it, chew the unyielding bread until your jaw adapts, and stand in line each morning with the same weary anticipation shared by everyone on board. You take one last bite, close your eyes, and resign yourself to the truth. On a prison hulk, edible is a generous category. The day begins before the sun even decides whether it wants to bother rising, announced by a guard's boots stomping along the deck with all the tenderness of a man attempting to wake the dead by violence alone. You open your eyes to a world that looks exactly as it did when you closed them, dim, cramped, and thick with breath and damp. A whistle shrieks through the corridor, and men sit up at once, rubbing their faces, yawning, stretching, each movement carried out with the weary precision of those who have repeated it far too many times already. You join them because not joining them is not an option, unless you secretly wish to be used as an example in the morning punishment round. The routine is simple enough that even half-sleeping minds can follow it. Roll from your bunk, make room for the next man, avoid stepping on anyone who might stab you for the offense, and file into a line that moves with the slow determination of a funeral procession. You stand shoulder to shoulder with the others, each of you swaying slightly as the ship shifts beneath your feet. A guard inspects the line with the practiced boredom of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by anything human beings can do. Breakfast appears in its usual form, a repeat performance of the watery broth and brick-like bread. You swallow it without ceremony, already knowing the taste, already knowing that the next 9 hours will stretch ahead like a punishment devised by someone who found regular punishment too gentle. The guard calls out the assignments, and the men peel off toward their stations. You hesitate only long enough to wonder how many days you have done this already before reminding yourself that counting days on a prison hulk is a surefire way to lose your mind. The first round of labor usually begins with hauling supplies across the deck or scrubbing the ship's surfaces until they shine exactly as much as century-old wood is capable of shining. You scrub with a brush so worn it looks like it is begging for retirement. The salt air stings your eyes. Your shoulders burn within minutes. Around you, men work quietly, each lost in thought or strategically conserving breath. A few manage jokes, though even the jokes sound tired, shaped by the understanding that laughter does nothing to dull the ache creeping into their arms. Eventually, a bell rings, a signal that labor has ended, which is technically true only because it heralds the beginning of punishment for whoever has earned it. Sometimes it is a man who talked back. Sometimes it is a man who slowed down too much. Sometimes it is a man who simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. You have already learned how to keep your eyes forward while this unfolds, not because you are cold-hearted, but because watching makes it harder to continue the rest of the day with whatever scraps of spirit you have left. Once the punishment ends, the next round of labor begins with no apparent acknowledgement of the intermission. You are sent to carry timber, or shovel coal dust, or move baskets of waste from one part of the ship to another. The tasks blur together until the motions feel automatic, your body moving because stopping would draw too much attention. Time stretches in odd ways here. An hour can last ages, while a full day can pass with the speed of one long, heavy breath you do not remember taking. At midday, the men receive another meal that resembles the first, possibly because it is the first, reheated and slightly thicker from evaporated water. You eat because you have learned that your energy must be rationed like a precious currency. The conversation during lunch is minimal, consisting mostly of sarcastic commentary about the ship, the guards, the government, and occasionally life itself. One man mutters he would rather be clinging to driftwood in the channel. Another agrees and says, at least driftwood does not shout orders. The afternoon brings more labor, often identical to the morning, as though the universe is reminding you that monotony can be its own form of punishment. You fall into the rhythm again. You tug ropes and lift crates and sweep and scrape. By now your muscles have stopped complaining, settling instead into a resigned stiffness that feels like part of your skeleton. A guard walks by with the expression of a man who believes the ship would function better if everyone on it, including himself, were replaced by obedient pieces of furniture. When the final bell signals the end of the workday, the men gather in small clusters, catching their breath, stretching their backs, or sitting in silence with their arms folded over their knees. Reflection is not optional here. It arrives each evening like a familiar visitor, sitting beside you whether you invite it or not. Some men pray, some curse, some simply stare at the boards, their thoughts drifting wherever the tide of exhaustion carries them. Night comes late, dim and muffled. You crawl back into your bunk, feeling the ship creak as if it too wishes to lie down. The routine has settled itself into you, etched into your bones. Wake, labor, punishment. Labor again, reflect. Labor again, sleep. It is a loop without edges or landmarks. A loop you now move through as if it has always existed. You close your eyes, knowing that in a few hours the whistle will return and the pattern will begin all over again. The wake-up call arrives before your mind has fully returned to your body. A shrill whistle slicing through the stale air like someone decided noise alone could qualify as punishment. You open your eyes to darkness that has not yet decided to soften into dawn, and for a few suspended breaths, you wonder if you dreamed the ship, the chains, the endless labor. Then the cold creeps in through the thin fabric of your clothes, sharp and unapologetic, and reality settles around you with the familiarity of a rude handshake. The men around you groan, mutter, stretch, and blink at nothing in particular, each performing the same ritual of pretending to be awake while their souls lag several minutes behind. The guards stomp through the berth with their polished boots and polished expressions, the sort of expressions that say they have been awake for hours and resent anything resembling comfort in others. One of them tosses the door open wider, letting in a gust of pre-dawn wind that slaps the back of your neck with icy enthusiasm. You sit up quickly because hesitation is not wise in these moments. A sleepy man once moved too slowly and found himself introduced to the business end of a truncheon before he had fully processed the sentence, "Get moving." You pull yourself from the bunk, joints cracking like old timber shifting in a storm, and shuffle into the narrow aisle. The line forms with the elegance of a herd of exhausted sheep, each man adjusting his shirt, rubbing his arms, and trying to look marginally alive. You file along with them, feet numb, breath fogging in the chill, and step toward the open deck where the muster takes place. The moment you emerge into the morning air, the cold hits with such force that you suddenly sympathize with icicles. It is the kind of cold that feels less like a temperature and more like a personal attack. The guards are already waiting, clipboards clutched under their arms, pencils poised like tiny weapons ready to strike a name from existence. One guard clears his throat with theatrical displeasure, which seems unnecessary since no one here looks even remotely capable of joy. He barks commands, and the men shift into lines, each one straightening their shoulders as though posture alone might convince the universe they are more alert than they appear. Names begin to echo down the deck. Each one is called with crisp impatience, and each man answers with whatever sound he can muster. Some give a half-hearted "here," others grunt. A few men's voices crack under the cold. When your name is called, you respond quickly, loudly enough to avoid suspicion, but not so loudly that the guard decides you are showing off. The whole process feels like a strange performance, a play staged too early in the morning for anyone to remember their lines. As the list continues, you shift your weight from one foot to the other, trying to coax warmth back into your toes. The boards under your feet are cold enough to seep through the soles of your shoes, making you suspect the ship has been storing winter inside its bones for decades. The wind snakes through your clothes like it is searching for weak spots, threading icy fingers along your spine. Men shiver openly, their breath forming small white clouds that drift away as if even the air wants to escape. Guards pace up and down the rows, eyeing each prisoner with the bored scrutiny of someone who has seen the same miserable faces too many times. One guard thumps the clipboard against his palm as if contemplating using it as a disciplinary tool. Another jots down notes, though you suspect the notes consist mostly of comments like "looks cold," "still alive," or potential trouble if given an opinion. When a man sneezes too loudly, the guard nearest him stiffens as though personal offense has been taken. The prisoner mutters an apology that is carried away by the wind before it can be heard. You find yourself focusing on small details, because thinking too deeply about anything else is a dangerous morning habit. You count the steps the guards take. Watch the way the sails overhead flap in the breeze despite being long dead. Notice how the sky begins to bleed from charcoal to dull blue. Eventually the names end, and the guards nod at one another with the grim satisfaction of men who have successfully completed a task they never wanted. The muster is dismissed with a curt gesture, and the line dissolves as the men shuffle back toward warmth, or whatever warmth can be found here. You follow them, rubbing your arms and imagining what it must feel like to wake somewhere that does not try to freeze you into submission. As you step below deck again, the cold loosens its grip, though not enough to forget it. The morning muster is over, but the day has only begun, stretching ahead with the predictability of a story you would never have chosen. Still, there is a strange comfort in the routine. Even if the routine is built from frost, fatigue, and the sound of guards taking attendance like disappointed schoolmasters, the ship creaks overhead, settling into the day. You breathe out once, twice, waiting for your body to thaw, and then join the others as the next part of the endless cycle begins. The guards do not need to shout for you to understand what comes next. The moment muster ends, the air on deck shifts from cold stillness to the restless shuffle of men preparing for another day of work that feels less like labor and more like a prolonged, government-issued apology for your continued existence. You file into the work gang with the others, each step accompanied by the faint rattle of chains brushing against the boards, a sound that has already become a sort of background music to life aboard the hulk. The guards unlock the tool chests with the enthusiasm of men revealing treasure, though the treasure consists of rusted picks, dented shovels, and iron bars that could double as medieval exercise equipment. You take the tool handed to you, not because it is particularly suited to the task ahead, but because refusing would be interpreted as a daring invitation to be introduced to the nearest punishment apparatus. The iron is cold against your palms, rough enough to scrape skin, and heavy enough to remind you that Victorian innovation occasionally consisted of making everything weigh twice as much as necessary. The men move in formation, a loose procession of clinking metal and grumbling voices. The chains between ankles limit your stride, turning what should be a straightforward walk into a synchronized shuffle that resembles a slow-moving centipede made of tired humans. A guard marches beside the line, swinging his baton with the absent-minded confidence of someone who knows the mere existence of the baton is motivation enough. You reach the shoreline or the work platform depending on the day, and today it appears the authorities have decided stone breaking is the correct activity to improve your moral character. The pile of rocks waiting for you looks large enough to rebuild Rome twice, and the foreman gestures at it as though he is presenting a magnificent feast. The only thing feast-like about it is that it promises to leave you equally exhausted and slightly nauseous. The first swing of your tool sends vibrations up your arms, rattling your bones in a way that suggests stone breaking was invented by someone who disliked bones. The impact produces a dull crack and a small cloud of dust that drifts into your face, coating your tongue with the flavor of complaint. Around you, the other prisoners settle into their rhythms, each thump, crack, and grunt blending into an industrial symphony that would horrify anyone with musical training. Guards patrol the perimeter, calling out corrections when someone swings too softly or pauses too long. One man sneezes so hard he nearly topples forward, and the guard warns him not to let personal weaknesses interrupt the Queen's schedule. The absurdity of the statement almost pulls a laugh from your throat, though you swallow it quickly because laughter is not a recognized part of the daily program. Hours stretch forward with the slow determination of an elderly tortoise. Your shoulders burn, your wrists ache. Sweat collects under your collar despite the cold, making the fabric cling to your skin. You learn to adjust your stance to avoid stumbling over your own chains, a skill no one dreams of acquiring, yet everyone masters eventually. Every time you pause to straighten your back, a guard's shadow glides across your peripheral vision, and you resume swinging before he needs to remind you. From time to time, the men exchange comments that seem designed to keep their spirits from fully dissolving. Someone complains the stones are reproducing when no one is looking. Another claims his tool is cursed because it only breaks when he is not holding it properly. These small scraps of humor drift between you like lifelines, flimsy but essential. Eventually the bell rings, a sound that should bring relief, but instead signals the halftime break of misery. The guards herd everyone into a loose cluster where you are allowed to stand, breathe, and consider whether your arms will detach from your body if you resume working after the pause. A few men sit, but most stay upright because getting up again requires a level of energy rarely found on this ship. When the bell rings again, you return to the task with the resigned patience of someone who knows the stones will not break themselves and the guards would be deeply offended if they did. You swing, strike, repeat, each motion blurring into the next. Time becomes a loop of weight, dust, and the constant vibration running through your arms. By the time you march back toward the hulk, your body feels like it has been carved from the same stone you have spent the day pulverizing. The chains clink in a weary chorus. The guards glance over you with their standard mixture of suspicion and boredom, and the sky overhead has begun to fade into evening. You climb the gangway with slow steps, feeling the familiar creak of the ship beneath you. Your place in the work gang has been earned through nothing more than existence, but you understand now why the system works. It does not need efficiency. It does not need enthusiasm. It only needs time, labor, and enough weight in your hands to crush the thought of anything beyond the next order. You breathe out once, tasting dust, salt, and the faintest hint of determination, then step back inside to face whatever comes next. You start to notice it gradually, the way a person notices a persistent itch or the subtle knowledge that someone nearby is chewing far too loudly. At first, the noises aboard the hulk blend into a dull, shapeless backdrop, the kind of sound your mind files under general suffering. But as the days stack together and your ears adjust, the ship reveals its full orchestra. It is not music, not in any civilized sense, but it is a symphony all the same, performed by wood, metal, water, and men who would rather be anywhere else. The creaking comes first. It is constant, endless, and strangely alive, as though the old hull is muttering to itself about the indignity of still being afloat after all these years. Every shift of the tide makes the boards groan. Every gust of wind sends a shudder down the beams, as if the ship is sighing loudly in protest. You lie in your bunk, listening to it at night, and sometimes you swear the wood sounds annoyed, like it is too tired to collapse but too stubborn to be quiet. Then there are the drips. You hear them in the dark, tiny notes echoing against metal and wood, each one landing with an insistence that reminds you of a leaky roof in a cottage you never lived in. Sometimes the drips fall from above, sometimes from somewhere behind the walls, sometimes from a place you cannot locate, even after you sit up and strain your ears. Men claim the Hulk leaks like a colander that has given up on dignity. The guards insist everything is perfectly safe. The truth, as usual, probably sits somewhere between denial and damp, but the ship itself is only part of the soundscape. The prisoners contribute their own movements, breaths, and complaints, turning the lower deck into a living cavern of human noise. Someone coughs every few seconds, a deep, rattling cough that sounds like it has been trapped in his chest since the Napoleonic Wars. Another man snores with such thunderous commitment that you imagine sailors passing by on smaller boats assume a wild animal has taken up residence. The snores come in varied lengths and intensities, some short and sharp, others long and mournful, like sad foghorns lamenting their life choices. The chains clink constantly. Walk across the deck, clink. Turn over in your bunk, clink. Shift your weight from one foot to the other, clink. The sound attaches itself to you, becoming a mechanical extension of every movement. Eventually, you stop noticing it until a moment of silence falls, and you realize the silence only exists because no one is moving at all. Of course, the voices are their own chapter in this acoustic diary. Men mutter in their sleep, speaking names or places you have never heard before. Some whisper to themselves when they think no one is listening, recounting memories or bargaining with fate. Arguments flare over nothing, snapping into existence like sparks from flint. One man insists another stole his bucket. Another claims the bucket was clearly abandoned. Someone else offers an opinion no one asked for, usually resulting in a collective demand that he stop speaking immediately. You hear threats muttered in tones soft enough to be taken as jokes, but sharp enough to discourage curiosity. Every day brings a new topic of debate. Who snores loudest? Who should be closest to the wall? Who is to blame for the mysterious disappearance of a crust of bread that barely qualified as food? At one point, two men spend 10 full minutes arguing over whose turn it is to be miserable before realizing the answer is obvious. It is everyone's turn all the time. The laughter that follows is quiet and cracked, but genuine enough to feel like a victory. Occasionally, from somewhere above, you hear the guards shouting orders or laughing at jokes no one else finds funny. Boots thud across the deck, followed by the clatter of equipment or the scrape of something heavy being dragged from one corner to another. Those sounds remind you that the world still exists beyond the dim lower decks, even if that world has little interest in improving your situation. But the most surprising sound comes during rare moments of stillness. When the ship settles, when the men settle, when even the water decides to take a breath, the silence arrives. It is never complete, never perfect, but for a heartbeat, you can hear your own inhale, steady and warm. In that tiny pause, the ship feels less like a prison and more like an exhausted giant resting in the water, carrying you through another night. Then someone coughs again, loudly enough to unsettle the moment, and the symphony resumes with all its wheezes, creaks, drips, groans, and complaints. You lie back and listen because there is nothing else to do, and because these sounds, maddening as they are, have become the strange, unruly heartbeat of your new world. You realize something is wrong when the morning routine slows instead of speeds up. The guards gather in a cluster near the main deck, their posture a little straighter, their expressions carrying that particular brand of satisfaction that only appears when someone else's suffering is about to become a teaching moment. The prisoners sense it too. Men straighten their backs, quiet their muttering, and turn their eyes toward the center of the deck with the resigned anticipation of people who have seen this scene enough times to know exactly what comes next. A man is dragged forward by two guards, his wrists bound, his face pale from a mix of fear, exhaustion, and the cold that clings to the morning air. You recognize him vaguely from the lower deck, a man who kept mostly to himself, someone who muttered jokes under his breath that no one understood but everyone appreciated. Now he stands trembling before the assembled crowd, and whatever he did wrong has officially graduated to spectacle. The guards announce his offense, though they speak quickly and without much enthusiasm. Something about backtalk, something about failing to follow orders, something about attitude. You get the sense the actual crime is less important than the opportunity to remind everyone why compliance is such a cherished trait aboard the Hulk. The guard in charge gestures toward the cat o' nine tails, hanging neatly from a hook like a museum exhibit no one should ever get close to. The whip looks harmless at a distance. Up close, the leather strands bristle with knots designed to tear rather than simply strike. The man is secured to the grating, his shirt pulled away from his back, exposing skin that looks too thin to endure what is coming. You look at the faces around you and see a mixture of dread, pity, and weary acceptance. No one looks away entirely. Looking away is suspicious. Looking too closely is suspicious. You attempt the middle ground, the gaze of someone who is present but not personally involved, a balancing act the ship has forced you to master. The guard who handles the whip steps forward with an expression of professional detachment. He taps the tails against his palm once, testing their weight, as though he is preparing to paint a fence rather than lash a man's flesh. When the first strike lands, the sound cuts through the cold air like a sharp crack of thunder. The man tenses, his hands gripping the frame so tightly his knuckles turn white. He grits his teeth, refusing to cry out, and you can almost feel the collective breath of the prisoners tighten with him. The second strike tears into his skin. This time a muffled sound escapes his throat, something between a gasp and a swallowed cry. The guards nod approvingly, as if pain is proof of moral progress. The third strike draws blood. A few men in the line shift their weight, not out of impatience but out of shared discomfort, each flinch traveling through the deck like a tiny shock wave. You keep your breathing steady, focusing on the details that will not make you sick, the way the sunlight barely reaches the deck, the way the ropes overhead sway with the tide, the way the boards creak under the shifting weight of men trying not to react. You notice the prisoners watching closely, not because they enjoy the spectacle, but because they need to remember the consequences. They file this moment away inside themselves, next to all the other reminders of how quickly a day can turn. By the seventh strike, the man's breath comes in sharp bursts. His back is a mess of welts and blood, the skin raised in jagged patterns that will scar no matter how long he serves. The guards remain unmoved, their faces carved into the same stern mask they wear during muster and inspections. You wonder if they ever feel anything at all, or if the ship has drained them too, turning them into wooden extensions of the vessel's discipline. When the final blow lands, the man slumps forward, held up only by the restraints. A guard steps in, checks his pulse with a bored glance, then nods to release him. They unfasten the bindings and let him sink to the deck, where two prisoners are ordered to carry him below. They do so gently, more gently than the guards ever would, lifting him with the quiet care of men who know they could trade places with him any day. The punishment ends the way it always does, with a guard proclaiming that discipline makes better men. The statement rings hollow, echoing across the deck before disappearing into the cold morning wind. The prisoners disperse slowly, stepping back into their routines with heavy limbs and heavy thoughts. You follow them, feeling the imprint of the scene stitched into your memory. You have witnessed the rules of the ship enforced in their rawest form. You have seen what happens when the hierarchy demands a demonstration, and as you descend toward the lower deck, the sounds of the ship return, groans, drips, coughs, whispers, filling the silence left behind. But one sound lingers longer than the rest. Quiet but unmistakable, the faint echo of each lash, still humming beneath your skin. You first consider escape on a day when the wind is warm and the sky looks almost friendly, the sort of day that tricks a tired mind into believing in miracles. You stand near the edge of the deck during a short break from labor, staring at the water below as it laps against the hull with rhythmic indifference. From a distance it looks calm, almost inviting, shimmering under the faint sunlight like a polished sheet of glass. You imagine slipping into it quietly, cutting through the surface like a fish with inconvenient limbs, and swimming toward the distant shore where life surely makes a little more sense. Then a guard stomps past you, musket slung over his shoulder, and the fantasy cracks before it fully forms. Armed men ring the ship at all hours, stationed at the railings, pacing the gangways, or leaning on posts as though relaxing while absolutely ready to fire. They look bored, but not bored enough to miss a splashing convict flailing past them like a particularly determined pigeon. You study their faces, noticing how each one carries the alertness of someone waiting for the slightest excuse to demonstrate what their weapon can do. Even if you somehow avoided the guards, there is the small matter of the chains. They cling to your ankles during the day, clinking with each step like sarcastic reminders of your limitations. At night, the heavier restraints appear, cold metal that steals warmth from your skin the moment it locks in place. Swimming with one set would be difficult. Swimming with both would be a comedy routine ending in tragedy. You once tried lifting the full weight of the leg irons off the ground with a single hand and succeeded for exactly half a second before nearly removing your own toes. Still, your imagination insists on considering the water, so you let it examine the option. The surface is deceptive. The docksmen speak of currents that twist through the harbor like hidden creatures, pulling downward, sideways, or nowhere sensible. Even the boats that travel the route regularly avoid certain channels. You overhear guards say the tide can strip a strong swimmer of control within seconds. You look down again, and suddenly the water does not seem so gentle. It feels like a creature pretending to sleep. Then there are the sharks. You have not personally seen one circling the hulk, but the older prisoners claim they appear often enough, drawn by the waste dumped from the ship and the general aroma of despair. One man swears he watched a fin trace a perfect circle around the hull for half an hour before drifting off in search of fresher entertainment. Another claims sharks have learned to associate splashing with meals, which you hope is an exaggeration but suspect is only half true. You picture yourself dropping into the water, making all the wrong noises, and being immediately greeted by something with far more teeth than compassion. Your own swimming ability does not help. The last time you attempted to swim was years ago, in a quiet river where the biggest threat was stepping on a stone that looked insultingly fish-like. You remember paddling unevenly, thrashing with more enthusiasm than technique, and swallowing enough water to learn humility. Now, imagining yourself performing a graceful escape stroke through cold, unpredictable harbor water feels like imagining yourself sprouting wings. On another afternoon, while hauling timber across the deck, you catch two prisoners whispering about escape as though discussing forbidden treasure. One explains the obstacles with the practiced tone of a man who has calculated every angle twice and abandoned each one thrice. The guards, the tides, the sharks, the weapons, the chains, the distance, the unpredictable weather, the cold. The number of witnesses who would absolutely shout to ensure the spectacle does not go unnoticed. By the time he finishes listing everything capable of ending an escape attempt, he sighs and scratches his beard like a scholar who has misplaced his final argument. Even the ship itself resists escape. The hull sits low in the water, preventing easy jumps. The ropes are guarded. The lifeboats are chained. The docks are patrolled by officers who think the hulk's prisoners might spontaneously form a synchronized swimming team. Every inch of the vessel has been arranged to ensure the fantasy stays exactly where it belongs, floating uselessly inside your mind. As night falls, you lie in your bunk, listening to the creaks and groans of the ship, letting your thoughts drift through the impossible. For a moment you imagine the perfect escape, the flawless dive, the silent swim, the quiet disappearance into freedom. It lasts only a heartbeat before the reality of the cold air seeps through your thin blanket again. Escape is something you think about because imagining freedom is a small rebellion the guards cannot confiscate. But deep down, you know the truth. This ship is a cage designed by people who understand hope a little too well. You meet the prison surgeon on a day when your shoulder aches too sharply to ignore, a deep grinding pain that began during the morning's labor and refused to loosen its grip. You tell yourself it is nothing, just a pulled muscle, or the result of lifting something that weighed half a small house. But the older prisoners notice the way you cradle your arm, and one of them, with the blunt honesty of a man who has seen too many others hobble themselves into worse trouble, tells you that if you do not report it, the guards will assume you are slacking, so you allow yourself to be herded toward the surgeon's corner of the ship, a place the men speak of in low tones, somewhere between fear and dark amusement. The surgeon occupies a tiny cabin that smells like old alcohol, damp cloth, and faintly metallic dread. When you step inside, your eyes adjust to the dim lantern light and meet a man whose appearance does not inspire confidence. His coat is stained with colors you cannot identify, and his hair sticks up in stubborn tufts as though he has been electrocuted by his own medical theories. His tools lie neatly arranged on a table that was not designed to hold anything sharp. Some of the instruments look familiar. Others resemble items a blacksmith would use when feeling experimental. He looks up at you with the weary expression of someone who has patched up far too many men who insist they are dying because of a splinter. He waves you closer with a hand that displays 3 fingers wrapped in bandages. You hope, for both your sakes, those bandages were not self-applied. He asks what is wrong, and you explain the ache in your shoulder, trying to sound casual while your body betrays you with every movement. He prods the sore spot with the enthusiasm of a man squeezing fruit to see if it is ripe. The pain shoots down your arm, and you hiss through your teeth. The surgeon nods, apparently satisfied. He announces that your injury is not serious enough for amputation, which you did not think was on the table until he brought it up. He rummages through his supplies and pulls out a jar of ointment that smells like it lost a fight with a moldy garden. He smears it across your shoulder with broad strokes, humming thoughtfully, as though your arm is a canvas and he is painting a masterpiece only he can appreciate. He explains his treatment philosophy while he works, a series of beliefs that make your skin crawl in ways unrelated to the ointment. He talks about humors, circulation, and the importance of keeping one's spleen cooperative. You nod because disagreeing with a man holding forceps the size of small tongs feels unwise. He pauses occasionally to demonstrate a tool or gesture at a diagram pinned to the wall, drawn with such poor anatomical accuracy that you suspect the artist had never actually seen a human body. When another prisoner limps in with a cut on his shin, the surgeon directs him to sit on a crate and begins preparing thread and a needle that looks like it could mend sails. You try not to watch, but your ears pick up every detail, from the soft muttering of the surgeon to the prisoner's sharp inhale as the stitching begins. The surgeon works quickly, tying the thread with the confidence of someone who has practiced but not necessarily mastered the art. He finishes by pouring a generous splash of alcohol over the wound, not for cleanliness, it seems, but for dramatic effect. He turns back to you, wiping his hands on a cloth that should have been retired several years ago. He tells you to rest the arm when possible, which is amusing considering the ship's schedule allows no such luxury. He suggests exercises that resemble instructions one might give a marionette. Then, with the air of a man who has delivered excellent care, he dismisses you with a nod and returns to examining his jars as though deciding which ones are least likely to explode. You step back into the corridor, the smell of the ointment clinging to your skin like a stubborn memory. The prisoners nearby glance at you with the silent question everyone asks after visiting the surgeon. Did you survive intact? You lift your arm carefully and wince. They nod knowingly. One murmurs that at least he did not try to bleed you, which he apparently does for almost everything else, including headaches, melancholy, and boredom. As you return to your bunk, the ship swaying beneath your feet, you let out a slow breath. Your shoulder throbs, but the encounter leaves you with a strange, reluctant appreciation. Medical care here may hover somewhere between guesswork and witchcraft, but it exists, and sometimes it even works, or at least it works just enough to keep you alive for another round of labor. You feel it before you admit it. A heaviness in your limbs, a heat blooming behind your eyes, and a dull ache that refuses to identify itself properly. You tell yourself it is just exhaustion, the kind that settles into bones after long days of labor and longer nights of restless sleep. But by midday, your forehead burns, your breath turns shallow, and every sound on the ship seems sharper, brighter, more irritating, as though the Hulk has turned up its volume just to mock you. The prisoners around you catch on before you do, giving you the wary side glances usually reserved for men arguing with invisible enemies. By the time the bell rings for the next shift, the air feels thicker, as if you are inhaling through soggy cloth. You stumble once on the ladder, and a guard barks at you to watch your step, as though falling to your death is an inconvenience he cannot afford. You nod mutely and keep moving, though each rung seems farther apart than it should be. When you finally reach the lower deck, one of the older prisoners gives your face a long look, the kind usually reserved for doomed mackerel. He mutters that you have the fever. Not a fever. The fever, the one that drifts through the Hulk like an uninvited guest, selecting victims based on some mysterious preference for misery. The air down here does not help. It clings to your throat, thick with the smell of damp wood, sweat, and the sourness that rises from men too long trapped together. Every breath makes your chest tighten. The confinement feels closer now, the beams lower, the shadows deeper, as though sickness has sharpened your senses in all the wrong ways. When the coughing starts, you try to stifle it, but the sound rips through your ribs and bounces off the walls, drawing a few sympathetic nods but mostly resigned stares. Illness is a regular visitor here, and no one has the energy left for surprise. A prisoner named Marrow, a wiry man with a talent for diagnosing ailments, he himself survived through pure stubbornness rather than medicine, approaches you with a squint. He presses the back of his hand to your forehead, declares you hotter than the devil's stove, and disappears before you can argue. He returns moments later holding a small bundle of herbs tied together with a piece of twine that looks suspiciously like it was torn from someone's waistband. The herbs smell like a combination of burnt grass and disappointment. He instructs you to chew them. You stare at the bundle, then at him, hoping he is joking. He is not. You chew. The taste hits immediately, bitter, earthy, and aggressively hostile. It settles on your tongue like a punishment for every poor life decision that led you here. You gag, but Marrow taps your shoulder sternly and tells you to keep chewing unless you want to end up in the surgeon's hands again. That threat alone is enough to make you swallow the mixture in clumps, each bite worse than the last. Your stomach makes an unhappy sound, as though preparing paperwork to file a complaint. Your fever builds as the hours crawl by. Sweat beads along your hairline, trickles down your spine, and soaks into your thin shirt until the fabric clings like damp seaweed. The deck beneath you shifts in rhythms you cannot predict. Sometimes it feels like the ship is breathing too quickly. Sometimes it feels like the boards are tilting at angles they have no business tilting. You close your eyes, but the darkness spins faster than the light. The guards, unsurprisingly, show no sympathy. When you falter during labor, they prod you forward, telling you fresh air will strengthen you, which is difficult to believe since the air feels more poisonous than curative. One guard mutters something about malingering, a word that sounds too fancy for the situation, and you briefly consider passing out just to demonstrate your commitment. When the workday ends, the prisoners guide you back to your bunk, steadying you with quiet grunts of effort. Marrow produces another concoction, a liquid this time, brewed from herbs that smell even worse than the ones you chewed. He insists it will sweat the sickness out. The drink tastes like boiled despair with a hint of moss. Your tongue goes numb halfway through, which he considers a sign of success. You curl into your bunk, the boards hot against your back, your breath shallow and uneven. Around you, the ship's familiar noises continue. Creaks, drips, coughs, whispers. But they blur together into something distant, a soundscape softened by fever and fatigue. The shadows shift as lanterns sway, casting thin stripes of gold across your face. At some point during the night, you wake to the sensation of cold air on your skin, a relief so sharp it steals your breath. For a moment, you cannot tell if the fever has broken or if your body is simply too exhausted to maintain it. You exhale slowly, tasting the bitter medicine still clinging to your tongue. You are not well yet, but you are no longer sinking. And on a ship where illness can sweep through the berths like a tide, that small victory is enough to carry you into morning. You start by watching them the way you watch storm clouds, cautiously, curiously, and with the quiet understanding that their moods can change the entire atmosphere of the day. The guards are everywhere, leaning against rails, pacing the gangways, hovering near the hatch, each one carrying enough authority to ruin your afternoon with a single sentence. At first, they all look the same, uniforms stiff from salt and routine, expressions carved into that stern shape people adopt when they think responsibility makes them important. But as the days unfold and you grow accustomed to the Hulk's strange rhythms, their differences begin to surface. Some of them are petty tyrants, men who seem to have woken up one morning, glanced at their reflection, and decided their life's purpose is to make small things difficult. They shout for the sake of shouting, correcting posture, tone, movement, even breathing if it sounds too confident. One guard scolds a man for stepping out of line by half a shoe length. Another demands you pick up a dropped tool more respectfully, though you are not entirely sure what respectful tool lifting looks like. These guards thrive on the smallest victories, the kind that only exist because no one here is allowed to argue. Then there are the bored veterans, older men who have clearly seen more than they requested from life. They pace slowly, boots thudding against the deck in the rhythm of long habit. Their eyes drift rather than focus, as though they are looking past the prisoners, past the ship, past the harbor itself, toward memories they would rather not revisit. They do their jobs, but with the heavy disinterest of someone performing a chore for the 1,000th time. These are the guards who sigh before giving an order, as though apologizing internally for the inconvenience of existing. One of them carries a pipe he never lights. Another keeps a small notebook tucked into his pocket, occasionally scribbling something you suspect has nothing to do with prison records. Their commands come less sharply. Their punishments are rare and usually reluctant. You watch one instruct a man to lift a crate again, slower this time, and the entire exchange feels more like a weary parent than a prison officer. They are not kind exactly, but they are tired enough that cruelty takes too much effort. But the strangest and most unsettling category is the small group of guards who display flickers of actual humanity. They do not advertise it. In fact, they try very hard to hide it behind the official mask worn by every officer on the ship, but you see it in the way one guard clears his throat awkwardly before handing a sick man a cup of clean water. You see it in the way another smuggles a second ladle of broth into someone's bowl when the cook is distracted. You see it when a guard pauses before ordering a beating, jaw tight, eyes uncertain, as though remembering he used to live a different life. One of these guards catches you watching him during labor. He nods once, a small gesture that acknowledges you not as a number on a clipboard, but as an actual person standing under the same weather. You nod back without thinking. He turns away quickly, shoulders stiffening, as if the moment embarrassed him more than it should. Later that day, when another prisoner collapses from exhaustion, this same guard is the one who steps forward first, shouting for water instead of punishment. The others look surprised. You are surprised too. Even the petty tyrants have odd layers. One spends his off hours carving small figures from spare wood, leaving them lined neatly on a beam near the stern, where no one dares touch them. Another has a habit of humming the same old tune during inspections, something strangely gentle that does not match his usual bark. You learn that if you stand in the right place, you can hear him humming before he rounds the corner, giving you just enough time to appear industrious. As you observe them day after day, the truth becomes unavoidable. The guards are prisoners too, trapped in their own routines, tethered to the ship's mood, shaped by the same cramped air and ceaseless groaning of timbers. Some cling to authority as a lifeline, others drift through their duties like ghosts. A few still carry enough softness to remember that suffering does not always need sharpening. The men around you talk about the guards with the cynicism of people who have endured too many orders and too few kindnesses. They mock them, fear them, resent them, but occasionally someone admits, in a low voice, that one particular guard looked the other way when he could have done worse. That one guard delivers news of punishments in the gentlest tone allowed by the job. That one guard steps between conflict and escalation just long enough for tempers to cool. You take all this in, quietly. You watch the guards the same way someone listens to the ship's creaks and groans, learning what each sound means and what danger it signals. Eventually, you understand that the guards are neither heroes nor devils. They are simply men caught between control and confinement, choosing every day which version of themselves they will become. On a prison hulk, that choice echoes louder than any shout. You learn about the black market the same way you learn most things on the hulk, by accident, by observation, and by the faint hope that asking questions will not get you stabbed with something improvised. It begins with a whispered exchange near the bunks one evening. Two prisoners leaning in close, voices low and cautious, hands moving with that quick, secretive precision you usually see in street magicians or men picking pockets. You do not intend to eavesdrop, but noise carries strangely in the lower deck, and soon you realize you are overhearing a negotiation involving half a crust of bread, a twist of tobacco, and a promise so vague it might as well be smoke. Curiosity gets the better of you. Over the next few days, you keep your eyes open. You notice the subtle signals, the carefully guarded glances, the way someone taps twice on a beam before slipping something into a sleeve. You begin to realize that trade here works on a system older than the ship itself, built not from coins or paper, but from desperation, scarcity, and whatever a clever man can hide in his shoe without limping noticeably. Tobacco is the reigning currency. Even men who do not smoke hoard it because someone else always will. A twist of the stuff can fetch anything from an extra ladle of broth to a bunk closer to the wall where the drafts are slightly less personal. You see a man trade a tiny scrap of tobacco for a stitching job on his torn shirt. You see another hand over a larger twist in exchange for someone else taking his turn scrubbing the latrine buckets. The negotiation looks solemn, almost ceremonial, and you suspect both men will remember it for years, because the smell of tobacco lingers longer than most friendships down here. Bread is the next valuable item. Not fresh bread, of course, since such a luxury would cause a riot, but the hardest, driest chunks that rattle like stones and can be used as currency, tools, or possibly blunt weapons. Some prisoners shave crumbs off their rations and hide them inside their bedding, building tiny reserves they guard more fiercely than gold. You watch one man trade a corner of his bread for a scrap of charcoal. Later that night, he uses the charcoal to draw a small picture on the wall beside his bunk, some little memory from home, crooked and smudged, but treated with reverence. You decide then that value aboard the hulk has nothing to do with logic. Favors, though, are the true powerhouse of the black market. They move quietly, passed from man to man, accumulating interest like silent debts. You see a prisoner slip a bucket of clean water towards someone who helped him during muster weeks ago. You hear rumors of a man who knows how to loosen chains ever so slightly, not enough to escape, but enough to sleep without bruising. Another man keeps track of which guards enjoy small flattery, and he trades that knowledge like a precious metal. The funniest part is that no one ever states the favors aloud. Not entirely. They hover in the air, understood, remembered, and honored, because breaking a favor is the closest thing to blasphemy available here. Contraband moves in stranger forms. You see a man pull a button from his shoe, only it is not a button but a tiny folded paper packet containing something powdered and suspicious. Another produces a small knife blade carved from metal stripped off a tool handle. It is dull, crooked, and more likely to injure the whiler than the target. But it is a blade, and on the hulk, that gives it value far beyond reason. Someone claims to have smuggled a peach pit onto the ship, which seems impossible until he shows it off with the pride of a man holding a crown jewel. No one knows what he plans to do with it, but the pit circulates through half a dozen trades before the day ends. Eventually, someone tests your own willingness to participate. A quiet man with tired eyes asks if you have anything worth trading, and you answer honestly that you barely have a shirt to your name. He studies you for a moment, then hands you a small twist of tobacco with a shrug. He says you will figure out how to make it useful. It is not charity. It is an invitation, a door opening into an unofficial world that exists beneath the official misery. You take the tobacco reluctantly, feeling the dry leaves crunch under your fingers. Around you, the ship groans, the lanterns sway, and the men settle into evening with the slow, familiar rhythm of caged animals who have learned to invent their own rules. You tuck the tobacco into your boot, feeling its presence as you walk. You are part of the market now, whether you meant to join or not. And strangely, that small scrap of contraband feels like the first piece of control you have held since stepping aboard the Hulk. You learn early that disputes aboard the Hulk follow a logic so strange it might as well be written in an ancient script. Men argue over anything: space, food, blankets, tools, noise, silence, whose foot touched whose foot, and whether or not the rats are forming factions. The confinements of the ship compress every irritation until it becomes personal, and you quickly understand that navigating conflict here requires more skill than avoiding the guards' tempers. It starts one evening when two men begin arguing over a spot on the deck no larger than a handkerchief. One claims he has stood there every night since he arrived. The other claims he marked it earlier with a scuff of his boot. Neither claim can be proven, and neither man is willing to surrender pride. So the argument escalates into gesturing, then posturing, then the kind of close-faced confrontation that makes every nearby prisoner lean back slightly, just in case something sharp appears. You do what everyone else does. Pretend not to watch while absolutely watching. The fight itself is short. One shove, a clumsy swing, a scuffle that lasts less than a minute before a guard stomps over and breaks it apart with the authority of someone who does not care about causes or outcomes. Both men receive a warning, though you suspect the guard enjoyed the brief entertainment before remembering his role. When the crowd disperses, the disputed patch of floor remains unoccupied, as if the ship itself has swallowed the conflict. But not every dispute ends so abruptly. Sometimes alliances form, loose ones made from necessity rather than trust. You see prisoners stand behind their bunkmates, not because they are friends, but because everyone fears isolation. Disputes ripple through these alliances like waves, shifting loyalties and changing the unspoken hierarchy. You learn to watch for who leans forward during a confrontation and who leans away. Those small movements tell you which way the wind is blowing. Threats, of course, circulate like rumors. Soft-spoken, carefully disguised, delivered with the kind of polite tone that makes them far more unsettling. A man might say he hopes you rest well at night, but the look in his eye suggests your sleep schedule interests him too much. Another might ask casually whether you ever feel the ship rocking harder than usual, as though hinting that accidents happen on moving vessels. You discover that responding to such comments requires the right balance of acknowledgement and dismissal. Too firm and you provoke, too soft and you invite more attention. You aim for a middle path, the kind that says you are aware, but not startled enough to be fun. Then there is the rat believer. You do not know his real name because everyone simply calls him Captain Vermin. He is wiry, restless, and always listening. He insists the rats have organized themselves into a council. He claims they meet behind the barrels near the stern and that they have begun assigning roles: scouts, thieves, morale officers. He warns you not to leave crumbs anywhere unless you want to owe the Rat Council a favor. At first you assume he is joking, but then you see how seriously he watches the rodents scurry through the shadows. You decide privately that even if he is wrong, it is unwise to challenge a man who has chosen to negotiate with creatures living under the floorboards. Oddly enough, Captain Vermin proves useful. He has a knack for predicting when tempers will flare, as though he senses the tension crawling through the air. He tells you to avoid a certain corner one afternoon. Later, you hear the familiar thud of fists in that exact spot. He advises you not to sit beside two men during supper. They argue minutes later, one accusing the other of taking an extra spoonful. You begin to wonder if the rats truly are communicating with him, or if he simply pays more attention than most. Over time, you learn to navigate the disputes yourself. You adopt the posture most men use, relaxed enough to appear unthreatening, but alert enough to respond if someone grows uncomfortably close. You avoid stepping on toes, literal or metaphorical. You learn that apologies are valuable only when timed correctly, and silence is often the safest contribution to any argument. You master the art of diverting conversations, offering small distractions, or pretending to misunderstand questions that feel like traps. Sometimes you witness moments of surprising restraint. A man lifts his fist as though ready to strike, then lowers it slowly when another prisoner touches his arm. Another steps back from a confrontation when he notices a guard turning his head, unwilling to lose privileges over pride. These moments remind you that survival is not just physical here. It is mental, emotional, and communal in strange, knotted ways. By the time you settle into your bunk that night, you understand that disputes on the hulk are inevitable, woven into the cramped life you share with too many men and too few comforts. Conflict exists the way the ship creaks, constant, shifting, alive. But somehow, in the crowded chaos, you also discover the quiet skill of keeping your footing, choosing your words, and avoiding battles that cost more than they gain. And if all else fails, you remind yourself of Captain Vermin's motto, spoken in a whisper like a secret blessing: always know where the rats stand. You begin noticing the ship's culture in the small things first, the tiny habits men repeat without thinking, the rhythms that emerge when enough people share too little space. It grows naturally, like moss on damp wood, shaped by boredom, survival, and the strange need for meaning in a place where everything feels stripped bare. At first you assume everyone is simply trying to stay sane, but as days fold into weeks, you realize the hulk has developed its own customs, jokes, rituals, and even an unspoken code of behavior that no one can remember learning, yet everyone somehow follows. The jokes are the easiest part to recognize. Humor here functions less like entertainment and more like oxygen. Someone cracks a one-liner about the bread being so hard it might file a man's teeth down. Someone else claims the surgeon once tried to treat a headache by yelling at it. The laughter that follows is rarely loud, never unrestrained, but it spreads in waves, small bursts that break the monotony. You learn quickly that humor aboard the hulk leans heavily on shared suffering, a sort of grim camaraderie that makes even the most miserable tasks feel slightly less crushing. If the joke is dark, it earns deeper laughs. If it is absurd, it earns the biggest ones. But the rituals are stranger. Some are practical, born from necessity. Every man checks his bunk boards with his foot before lying down, testing for rot or loose nails that might turn sleep into a medical event. Others tap the beam above their heads twice before lights out, claiming it keeps nightmares away. You adopt the tapping ritual without admitting why, telling yourself it is simple habit even though you know better. In a place where control is scarce, rituals are anchors. Meal time carries its own customs too. The cook has established a rule that no one speaks while the ladle is in motion. Silence, he claims, keeps the stew from turning on you. It makes no sense, and you want to challenge it. But every man obeys automatically, as though words during serving might summon some lurking curse. When the last bowl is filled, someone inevitably mutters, "May it not kill us," and the line exhales in collective agreement. The superstitions bloom thicker than the mold along the beams. No one whistles below deck because a prisoner long ago swore it summoned bad spirits. A man with a crooked scar across his cheek insists the ship knocks 3 times before someone dies, and after you hear a particularly loud crack during the night, you lie awake far longer than you intend to. Another prisoner believes that if you see 2 rats cross paths at the same moment, you will have good luck the next day. You witness it once, and the next morning a guard forgets to check your chain, giving you an extra moment of ease. You do not publicly credit the rats, but privately you note the coincidence. The storytelling tradition is the heart of the culture, beating steadily through every evening. When labor ends and men gather in the dim glow of lanterns, stories begin to circulate. Some are true, most are not. But truth matters far less than delivery. A man with a slow, deliberate voice tells tales of ghost ships that wander the coast. Another recounts the adventures of a thief who once escaped prison by climbing through a drain pipe, although the details change every night, suggesting the narrator enjoys creative freedom more than accuracy. Even the silent prisoners lean closer when the storytelling begins, their faces softened by flickering light. One night, a younger man recites a tale about a convict who charmed a guard by teaching him a song from home. The story ends with the guard helping him escape into the night. The listeners groan, calling it nonsense, but they ask him to tell it again 2 nights later. Hope, even when fictional, is a rare and valuable resource. Sometimes you contribute, tentatively at first. You describe a memory from your childhood, a story so simple you expect no one to care. But they listen. They nod. One man chuckles at a detail you nearly omitted. The weight in your chest loosens a little. You realize then why storytelling thrives here. It allows the prisoners to step outside the ship for a few minutes, to be elsewhere in their minds, even when their bodies remain chained to the hulk. The culture surprises you, not because it exists, but because it feels alive. It shifts, grows, adapts. A thing shaped by men who have very little, yet still manage to build meaning from the scraps left to them. You begin to rely on the jokes, the rituals, the whispered superstitions that travel through the dark. They tether you to something human, something communal. And as another night settles around you, the lantern lights swaying with the tide, you listen to a new story unfold and realize you have become part of the living lore of the ship, another thread woven into the strange tapestry that holds the hulk together. You learn very quickly that weather aboard the hulk is not something you experience so much as something you endure. It announces itself in creaks, in shudders. In the uneasy way, the ship seems to tense like a living creature bracing for impact. You have felt bad weather before, but land weather behaves differently, politely even. On land, storms rage outside your walls. Here, they crawl straight through them. The first storm you encounter arrives without ceremony. One moment the harbor sits in a moody gray hush. The next, the sky splits itself open with a gust that sends every loose rope on the ship snapping like whips. Rain hits in sheets, cold and relentless, drumming against the deck with the enthusiasm of an angry drummer overdue for a meal. The timbers groan so deeply you feel the vibration through your feet. The men around you stiffen instinctively, some gripping beams, others muttering quiet acknowledgments to whatever powers they believe control the sea. The ship pitches more than you expect for something chained to the shore. It rolls, not enough to send you tumbling, but enough to make your stomach sway as if trying to match the rhythm. Wind howls between the ribs of the hulk, slipping through every crack and seam until the interior feels like a series of drafty lungs exhaling over your neck. You try to steady yourself, but the boards under your boots have opinions of their own, shifting just enough to remind you that your footing is a privilege, not a right. Later that night, the storm grows wilder. Lanterns bow in the gusts, their flames trembling, throwing wild shadows across the lower deck. Water drips from the seams overhead, each drop cold enough to make a man flinch. Someone curses the weather. Someone else says the ship has survived worse. A third insists the hulk is secretly hoping the storm will finish it off so it can finally rest. You cannot tell whether he is joking. Sleep becomes impossible. The ship rocks in uneven patterns, each movement reminding you that despite the chains anchoring it, nature still gets the last word. The prisoners lie awake in their bunks, staring upward, listening to the timbers complain. Every now and then the entire hull shudders in a way that makes your heart lurch harder than the ship itself. Then there are the fog days. The first time you see it, the world outside the deck looks erased, the shoreline swallowed whole, the water blending with the sky in a featureless white that devours sound. You stand at the railing and feel like the ship has drifted into nothingness. Voices carry strangely in the fog, stretched thin, distorted, as if spoken underwater. The guards pace more loudly during these mornings, perhaps afraid the world has forgotten them, or perhaps hoping it has. Fog wraps around the hulk like a cold blanket that someone forgot to warm, pressing against your face with damp fingers. It soaks into your clothes, your hair, even your breath, until you feel washed out and faded. Some men claim fog makes the ship quieter. Others say it makes it louder. You discover they are both right, depending on where you stand. One spot might feel perfectly still, the next echo like a cathedral built for ghosts. But it is the cold that tests you most. Winter on the hulk does not arrive with clear announcements. It creeps in slowly, through the boards, through the blankets, through the very spaces between breaths. It settles into your bones with the determination of a tenant who has no intention of leaving. The chill in the lower deck grows so intense that even breathing feels icy. You wrap your arms tighter around yourself at night, pulling your thin blanket close as if it can make a meaningful difference. Your fingers numb during labor. Your jaw trembles so hard you expect your teeth to file themselves down. Some men stuff extra cloth into their sleeves. Others pace constantly when not working, trying to generate warmth through motion. You learn to move your hands often, clench, unclench, anything to keep the blood from abandoning them entirely. The guards do not seem bothered by the cold, though you suspect they simply pretend better. They pace briskly, calling out orders that puff white clouds into the air. When they turn their backs, you sometimes catch them rubbing their arms or stamping their feet, small movements they would never admit to. Weather on the hulk is not an inconvenience. It is a presence, a companion you did not invite. Storms shake you awake. Fog steals the edges of the world. Cold burrows into your joints and sets up camp. You endure each shift, each season, each sky change, learning that nature has a sharper sense of humor than any prisoner aboard. And yet, when dawn breaks after a long night, when the storm quiets or the fog lifts, you find yourself standing on deck, staring out at the fragile stretch of horizon. For a moment, the hulk feels almost peaceful, uncomfortable, cold, creaking, but peaceful in the way only something battered and stubborn can be. You hear them before you see them. The shuffle of boots on gangplanks, the clank of irons being adjusted, and the familiar grumble of guards who sound personally offended that the world keeps producing new prisoners for them to supervise. You have been aboard long enough to recognize the rhythm. Chains first, curses second, despair third. It is almost ceremonial. The ship itself seems to sense newcomers approaching, timbers giving a small groan as if bracing for fresh disappointment. When the new prisoners appear on deck, they look like livestock presented for inspection, wide-eyed, bewildered, and trying very hard not to trip over their own restraints. Some squint at the hulking black silhouette of the ship as though hoping it is merely a badly constructed joke. One man mutters a prayer. Another whispers something that sounds like a promise to write a strongly worded letter to someone important, as if paperwork can liberate him from the chains currently cinched around his ankles. A few still cling to optimism. They ask the guards how long they will be here, whether this is temporary, whether they will be transferred, whether they can appeal, whether someone has made a terrible mistake. The guards respond with the same expression they reserve for barnacles, a mixture of disinterest and mild disgust. One guard finally answers the most persistent man by saying that everything is temporary if you think about it long enough, which is not reassuring, but does shut him up. You watch the procession with the strange mix of familiarity and discomfort that comes from recognizing pieces of your own past stumbling toward you. You see the same tremble in their hands, the same stubborn tilt of their chin as they try to look braver than they feel. Memory stings like cold seawater. You remember your own walk across that plank, the way the ship loomed like a floating coffin, the way your stomach twisted when you realized there was no turning back. The hulk teaches its lessons quickly, but first one is always the hardest. This is your world now. The old prisoners gather along the deck, some out of curiosity, others out of boredom. A few grin with predatory amusement, like cats waiting to see which mouse panics first. The veterans lean against railings or sit on coils of rope, arms crossed, expressions carefully crafted to appear unimpressed. They watch the newcomers the way gamblers watch cards being dealt, looking for tells, weaknesses, or potential allies. One of the older hands, a man with a scar across his temple shaped almost like a misplaced punctuation mark, leans toward you and mutters that you can always tell which ones will cry by nightfall. You do not ask how he knows. You do not want to know. But within a few minutes you identify at least two candidates, both trying desperately to look composed and failing in entirely different ways. One has the shaky determination of a man trying to convince himself that nothing is wrong. The other has the defeated stillness of someone who realized everything is wrong 5 minutes ago and is conserving his energy for the next disaster. As the guards bark orders, the new arrivals attempt to form lines. This would be easy if their ankles were not chained together with the precision of a drunken blacksmith. They shuffle awkwardly, bumping into each other, occasionally apologizing despite having no control over where their legs go. The guards shout louder. The prisoners stumble faster. It becomes a kind of tragic choreography, clumsy but earnest, like a dance designed by someone who has never seen humans before. Then the smell hits them. It always does. You see, the moment their nostrils flare, the moment confusion shifts to alarm. The Hulk has a particular scent, a blend of damp wood, stale sweat, and the persistent undertone of men living too close to one another. It settles into newcomers with the speed of an unwelcome handshake. A few gag. One looks genuinely offended, as if the ship has failed to meet his sensory expectations. Introductions occur in the loosest possible sense. The guards list rules no one truly listens to, the kind delivered so frequently they have lost all meaning. The newcomers nod because nodding seems safe, because nodding implies cooperation, because nodding delays whatever consequences await non-nodders. Behind them, the older prisoners exchange knowing looks, silently betting how long each fresh face will survive before adapting or breaking. Finally, the line moves. The new men are guided toward the lower deck, toward the dark that swallows all bravado, toward the narrow world you already know too well. You watch them go, disappearing into the mouth of the ship one by one, carrying fear, questions, and whatever scraps of hope they have not yet been forced to surrender. And as the last of them vanishes below, you feel the ship settle, the boards shifting slightly under your feet, making room for the newest members of its unwilling family. The Hulk expands and contracts with every arrival, swallowing stories and secrets as easily as it swallows air. Some of these men will become familiar, some will fade, some will vanish in ways no one speaks about. But right now, they are simply new, wide-eyed and trembling, stepping into a world they cannot yet understand, just like you once did. Time does not pass on the Hulk so much as it dissolves. At first you try to measure it. You mark mornings by the clang of chains, by the sour smell of the first meal, by the guards' heavy steps thudding across the deck. You count evenings by the dimming of lanterns, by the soft murmurs drifting through the lower deck, by the thin line of cold that slips into your blankets. But after enough repetitions, the shape of a day becomes indistinguishable from the shape of the next, each one wearing the same worn face, each one settling over you like a damp cloth, with no intention of being removed. You wake with no memory of dreaming. You move through labor with motions that feel borrowed from someone else. You eat, though you barely taste anything, and sleep, though your body never truly rests. The rhythms of the Hulk seep into you until you no longer know whether you are following them or they are pulling you along. Conversations circle the same topics. Jokes repeat themselves. Arguments replay in familiar patterns, sometimes with different participants, sometimes with the exact same ones who have already forgotten they argued in the first place. The strangest part is how quickly your sense of personal time erodes. You tell yourself you have been here only a short while, maybe a handful of weeks, but then a prisoner casually mentions something that happened when you first arrived, and you realize the memory already feels softened at the edges. You try to recall how many mornings you have stood in muster, how many times you have hauled timber, how many nights you have listened to the ship groan in its sleep. The numbers refuse to line up. They drift, contradicting each other, sliding across your thoughts before slipping away entirely. Conversations with the older prisoners reveal that many stopped counting long ago. One man claims he has been aboard since he had color in his hair. Another insists he remembers the ship before it was a prison hulk, though you suspect he exaggerates or confuses it with another vessel. They speak of time as though it is a rumor, something they once understood but no longer trust. When you ask how long they think you have been here, they pause, glance you over, and offer answers that differ wildly from your own estimates. Some days feel endless, stretched thin and brittle. Others vanish before you fully inhabit them, slipping past like water through fingers. Sometimes you awaken certain you missed a day entirely, though no one else seems to share the sensation. You find yourself repeating tasks without remembering starting them. The scrape of a shovel, the rasp of a saw, the repetitive motion of coiling rope, all blend into one continuous gesture that spans across countless hours. You begin to lose track of your thoughts too. Ideas that once felt sharp now float like driftwood, bumping into one another without direction. You speak less, not because you have nothing to say, but because you no longer know which thoughts matter. Some men cope by talking endlessly, recounting the same stories again and again as if anchoring themselves in repetition. Others withdraw into silence, staring at the same knot in the wood for minutes at a time. You hover somewhere in between, unsure which path leads to fewer frayed edges. It becomes harder to remember who you were before Hulk. Your old routines blur. Your old preferences seem faint. Even your own face feels unfamiliar in your mind, as though you are recalling a portrait of someone you used to know rather than a reflection you once saw daily. There are moments you catch yourself responding automatically to commands before fully processing them, your body moving with the practiced resignation of a man who has forgotten he once had choices. The ship amplifies this erosion. Its creaks, its echoes, its repeating cycles become the only reliable markers of existence. You learn the subtle differences in sound between calm days and restless nights, between storms and stillness, between the timbers expanding in the midday heat and contracting in the cold. These become your hours, your minutes, your seasons. Yet within the blur, strange pockets of clarity appear. A joke that hits just right. A story told with enough detail to lift you momentarily above the monotony. A sliver of sunlight landing through a cracked board in such a precise line that you suddenly remember what warmth felt like. These moments do not restore your sense of time, but they remind you that you are still capable of feeling it slip. One night, lying in your narrow berth, listening to the steady drip of condensation hitting the floor, you realize that time aboard the Hulk has its own rules. It slows when you ache for it to pass. It races when you desperately want to hold something still. It loops, repeats, crumbles, reforms, and sweeps you along until the boundaries of your life before and after blur into the same muted shade. And as you drift toward sleep, you understand the quiet truth that unnerves every man on the Hulk. You are not losing time. Time is losing you. You do not so much volunteer for deck duty as drift toward it, nudged by the slow collapse of your patience and the growing sense that if you spend one more hour inhaling the lower deck's damp breath, you might simply fold into the wood like a forgotten scarf. When the guards call for men to handle ropes and scrub the planks above, your hand rises before your mind even votes on the matter. The guard looks surprised, as though he expected volunteers to be mythical creatures, but he jerks his chin and waves you forward. Climbing the ladder feels like crawling toward another world. The air changes first, losing its sour thickness and gaining something close to sharpness. It stings your nose in a way you barely remember, a reminder that wind can move freely when not bullied by mildew and body heat. When you step onto the deck, sunlight spills across your shoulders so suddenly it feels like someone has thrown a warm blanket over you from behind. You pause, breathing in, lungs stretching as if waking from a long, uneasy sleep. For a moment, you simply stand there, blinking, trying to remember the last time you saw the sky without a layer of gauze between you and it. The clouds drift lazily overhead, smug in their freedom. The gulls cry with the arrogance of creatures that have never answered to a schedule. Even the water looks different from up here, wide and shifting, not the dark slice you glimpse from the hatch. The other prisoners assigned to deck duty move with slow purpose, savoring the same miracle you are. No one says it aloud, because acknowledging it directly might break the spell. But every man's shoulders loosen just a little. Even the guards seem less monstrous in daylight, their faces less severe, their silhouettes less looming. One of them yawns openly. Another leans on the railing and watches a distant fishing boat, lost in some private memory of a life where shouting was not his primary hobby. Your duties are simple: scrubbing boards, coiling ropes, hauling buckets of seawater, all of it repetitive and mildly miserable, but performed under an open sky instead of in stale darkness. You scrub until the salt bites your knuckles, but you do so while squinting at sunlight glinting on the water, which makes the sting feel almost luxurious. At one point, a gull lands near you, eyeing your bucket with shameless interest. You whisper a warning that you will absolutely not be blamed for feeding it, but the gull does not care. It marches closer, bold as brass, until a guard stomps, sending it flapping away in an explosion of offended feathers. Between tasks, you steal glances at the shoreline. Buildings rise and fall along the curve of the harbor, chimneys coughing thin streams of smoke. People move along the docks, free to go wherever they choose, and the sight hits your throat in a way you did not expect. The world is still moving out there. It has not paused to match your pace. It does not wait for you. It never did. Yet for the first time in too long, watching that world does not feel like torture. It feels like remembering. One of the older prisoners on deck duty, a man who has perfected the art of working slowly without technically slacking, grunts beside you. He says deck duty keeps a man sane. Not entirely sane, he clarifies, but sane enough. He claims that sunlight adds years to your life, though he also claims that seawater cures toothaches, so you take his medical theories with a grain of salt the size of a cannonball. Still, you believe him. Not about the toothaches, but about the sanity. As the hours pass, you rediscover small pleasures. The warmth of the boards beneath your knees, the faint scent of salt carried on the wind, the feeling of standing upright without hunching instinctively. You hear laughter rise from a cluster of men, light and unguarded, the kind of laughter that springs from relief rather than comedy. Even the creaking of the ship sounds different up here, less like a complaint and more like a weary hymn sung to the open air. At one point, a guard tells you to adjust a rope line near the bow. The sun catches you full in the face, spreading heat across your skin. You close your eyes for 2 seconds, maybe 3, and in that tiny fragment of time, you are not a prisoner. You are a human being standing in sunlight, breathing wind that has touched 5 countries before reaching you. It is fleeting, fragile, easily shattered when the guard barks at you to move faster. But the warmth lingers in your bones even as you return to scrubbing. When deck duty ends and you are herded back down ladder, the lower deck greets you with its familiar stale embrace. The air feels heavier, the shadows feel thicker, but something inside you holds onto the memory of sunlight with a grip tighter than the ship's own chains. It may not free you, but for a brief slice of the day, it reminded you that you are still someone worth freeing. You first notice it during a pause in work, one of those rare moments when the guards are distracted, the prisoners are catching their breath, and the ship seems to ease its constant complaining just long enough for silence to bloom. You look toward the shore, expecting the same dull stretch of buildings and chimneys, but instead you see movement. A woman carrying a basket, walking steadily along the harbor path, a child pulling at her skirts, a fisherman leaning on a piling, whistling a tune that rides the breeze with lazy confidence. They are small from this distance, tiny shapes slipping along the world like it owes them passage. You watch them because they are moving freely, their steps light in a way you almost forgot existed. It hits you then, quietly but sharply. that life is still happening out there. Real life, the sort where people choose their direction, choose their errands, choose when to sit and when to stand, when to speak and when to fall silent. Choices seem like luxuries now, delicate things, worn soft by people who do not understand their value. One fisherman scratches his beard, stares at the water, and spits. That single, thoughtless action feels extravagant. Ships come and go all day, gliding through the harbor with the ease of creatures born to motion, sleek schooners with bright sails, trading vessels heavy with cargo, fishing boats bobbing eagerly, and navy ships that slice through the water like blades. You find yourself turning each time one passes, your eyes following the slow sweep of its hull as if it might reveal something meaningful. Some fly flags snapping in the wind. Others trail smoke from their chimneys, leaving long smudges across the sky. Even the smallest rowboat possesses more freedom than you do. You try not to romanticize them, but it is impossible not to. Each vessel carries stories you will never hear, people you will never meet, ports you will never see. You imagine what the decks feel like beneath their boots, how the air must smell away from this stagnant harbor, how it must feel to travel without chains clinking at your ankles. The ships do not look back at you. They glide past the hulk like passing a gravestone, acknowledging its presence only by choosing not to get too close. Sometimes you see civilians pause on the shore, their faces turning toward the hulk with curiosity or discomfort or mild pity. Some stare openly, squinting as if trying to make out individual prisoners. Others avoid looking altogether, walking faster, heads down, as if the sight of the ship might infect them with misfortune. Children seem braver. They point, whisper, tug at sleeves, asking questions their parents probably do not want to answer. You watch them until they move out of sight, swallowed by the town. The painful part is not their freedom, it is their unawareness. They move in a world that continues smoothly, indifferently, as though your existence has no weight in its balance. You know this on some level, but seeing it daily forces the truth into sharper focus. The world is not waiting for you. It is not holding space for your return. It spins merrily along, leaving you anchored to a floating memory of mistakes and consequences. Some evenings the sunset casts gold across the water, turning everything warm and forgiving. You watch it, feeling a softness creep into your chest, a strange peace that comes from witnessing something beautiful, even though it refuses to belong to you. The colors reflect off the waves, dancing in patterns you never see below deck. The other prisoners watch too, in their own quiet ways. Some lean against the railings, some pretend to look elsewhere, but all of you feel the same ache, even if no one says it aloud. Occasionally, a ship passes close enough that you can hear laughter drifting from its deck. It is a light, easy sound, swirling across the gap between you like a reminder of a language you no longer speak. You absorb it with a twist of longing and something else, something almost like gratitude. Even caged men can appreciate joy, even if it is not theirs. There are days when fog hides the shoreline entirely, and for a fleeting moment you can imagine the world pauses with you. But the tide comes in, the fog thins, the silhouettes reappear, and life resumes its distant parade. You always feel a strange heaviness then, like stepping back into your body after drifting outside it. Watching the world from the hulk is like watching a play through a narrow crack in the curtain. You see enough to understand what you are missing, but never enough to forget where you stand. And still, every time your gaze drifts toward the horizon, you cannot stop yourself from wondering how it would feel to walk on shore again, just once, with no chains and no schedule and no guards waiting to shout your name. Winter does not arrive all at once. It creeps in quietly, slipping down the hatch in thin drafts that curl around your ankles like curious ghosts. At first you think the cold is temporary, the kind that comes and goes with passing weather. But soon it settles with the confidence of something that has packed luggage. The air aboard the hulk grows sharper each morning, biting at your cheeks, stinging your nose, and turning every exhale into a small flicker of mist. You start waking with your blanket stiff, in places where your breath has frozen into it during the night. The frost forms inside the hull, lacing the beams in delicate patterns that would be almost beautiful if your fingers were not going numb just looking at them. The timbers groan differently in the cold, lower pitched, as if the ship is muttering complaints under its breath. Men shuffle along the lower deck with their arms clamped tight to their sides, shoulders hunched so high they nearly meet their ears. Conversation becomes a series of grunts, mutters, and the occasional curse directed at the general concept of winter. Every task grows harder. Ropes freeze into stiff cords that resist every tug. Buckets stick to the deck unless pried free with a boot. Even the morning muster becomes an exercise in endurance. Prisoners lined in trembling ranks while the guards pace between them, exhaling great plumes of mist that make them look like irritated dragons. One guard claims the cold toughens men. Another admits his toes have not thawed since Monday. You suspect he exaggerates, but not by much. Your fingers suffer most. No matter how tightly you shove them beneath your arms or into your sleeves, they ache ceaselessly. The skin cracks along your knuckles until they bleed in thin red lines, which sting horribly during labor. You see other prisoners wrap cloth around their hands, improvising gloves that look more like bundled rags. Some manage to warm their fingers briefly by pressing them against lanterns, though this is usually interrupted by a guard shouting about fire hazards. You try it once and nearly sear off a layer of skin, but for a moment, the heat feels miraculous. The rations somehow grow worse in winter. The broth is thinner, the bread harder, the salted meat colder than your own mood. Steam never rises from the bowls, which means the cook has successfully achieved the rare feat of making a hot meal colder than the air. Men gather around their food like desperate archaeologists drilling into ancient ice, hoping to find something edible preserved inside. You chew numbly, your jaw stiff enough to feel like a reluctant hinge. Complaints become the soundtrack of winter. They echo through the lower deck with the same persistence as dripping water. One man blames the cold for every ache he has ever had, and a few he invents on the spot. Another insists his bunk is colder than everyone else's, a claim he repeats so passionately that you wonder if the boards beneath him are secretly haunted. Even the veterans, who normally keep their commentary to a minimum, grumble about frost settling on their blankets like an unwanted roommate. Yet while the prisoners suffer, the rats seem delighted. They skitter boldly across the beams, plump and energetic, thriving as though winter is their own private holiday. You catch one dragging an entire scrap of bread with a determination usually reserved for heroes. Another nestles in a warm pocket between barrels, fur puffed out proudly. Captain Vermin, the man convinced the rats hold meetings, claims they grow more organized in the cold. You try not to think about what that implies. Nights are the worst. The cold sinks deepest then, filling the lower deck inch by inch until it feels like sleeping inside a carved block of ice. You curl into your berth, pulling your knees to your chest, hoping to trap what little heat your body still remembers. Every movement sends a shiver through you. The men around you shuffle under their blankets, creating a chorus of rustling cloth and chattering teeth. Lanterns flicker weakly, producing more shadows than warmth, and the darkness seems thicker, heavier, as if winter itself is pressing down on the ship. Sometimes you wake before dawn with your fingers stiff and unresponsive. You pry them open, one by one, whispering curses at the cold as though it might take offense and leave. You imagine warm places, hearth fires, wool coats, steaming mugs, anything that could thaw the frost settling inside your bones. But the hulk is a stubborn beast, and winter has chosen it as a nesting ground. Still, beneath all the misery, there is a strange solidarity that forms. Men huddle closer during meals. They share cloth scraps, rub their hands together, and swap strategies for staying warm with the seriousness of generals planning a campaign. Laughter becomes rarer, but more precious. A single joke can warm an entire group longer than any lantern. By the time you crawl into your bunk again, the cold has become a constant companion, something you tolerate rather than resist. You lie listening to the ship creak under winter's weight, knowing it will outlast you, outlast all of you, and continue complaining long after the frost melts. Winter is not a season here. It is an opponent. Summer announces itself with a heaviness that settles over the hulk long before the prisoners acknowledge it. At first, it is only a change in the air, a subtle thickening, as if the ship has begun exhaling warm breath directly onto your neck. The guards complain about it before anyone else does, muttering as they peel off their coats, fanning themselves with whatever paper they can find. But the moment the lower deck begins to feel like someone has lit a secret fire beneath it, you know summer has arrived with all the subtlety of a drunk giant. Heat on a wooden hulk is not the same as heat on land. It does not simply sit in the air. It seeps, it saturates, it sinks into the beams and radiates back out of them, trapping every ounce of warmth like a miser hoarding coins. The hull turns into a giant oven that never fully cools, no matter how many cracks and seams allow thin slivers of air to wriggle through. Sweat gathers across your skin before you even start working, dripping into your clothes, turning the fabric into something clingy and unpleasant. Every prisoner glistens in the dim light, not attractively, but like overworked livestock. The stench becomes a creature of its own. It rises from the boards, from the bedding, from bodies pressed too close together. Even the rope coils seem to sweat. The air grows so thick it feels chewable, and breathing becomes a negotiation between need and sheer disgust. Men wave their hands in front of their faces as if trying to fan away a curse. Others tie cloth around their noses, which does nothing except make them look like exhausted thieves. You have never known overcrowding until the first true week of summer. Every inch of space feels smaller, as though the ship shrinks in protest of the heat. Bodies shift constantly, seeking cooler patches of wood that do not exist. No one wants to sit near anyone else, yet everyone must. The lower deck, forcing men into proximity usually reserved for sardines or lovers. Tempers flare with alarming speed. A man bumps another with his elbow, and the resulting argument stretches into the kind of slow burn that only humidity can fuel. Sleep becomes a cruel joke. Your bunk, already narrow, now feels like a wooden coffin lined with moist fabric. The boards beneath you radiate warmth like a disgruntled stove. You toss, turn, swear softly into the stale air, and still cannot find a position that does not feel like lying inside someone's armpit. The snoring is worse in summer. The coughing, too. Even the nightmares sound louder. Above deck offers small relief. But even the sunlight feels personal, as though it has singled you out for punishment. You stand at the railing, hoping for a breeze, but the air is still, smothering, heavy with the scent of seaweed and tar. Guards stomp about with shirts sticking to their backs, their tempers shorter than usual. One snaps at a gull for landing too close. The gull stares back with better composure. Water becomes the most precious substance in existence. You drink whenever you can, though the water tastes vaguely metallic and slightly warm, like it has been stored inside a blacksmith's pocket. Men hover near buckets during cleaning duty, each pretending not to be waiting for a spare sip. The surgeon warns about heat sickness, though he prescribes remedies that involve herbs no one has seen since winter, so his advice carries little weight. The rats, of course, flourish. They scamper boldly through the beams, plump and shiny, as if summer is their grand festival. They look healthier than the prisoners, which feels profoundly unfair. Captain Vermin claims they store secret water somewhere. You briefly consider asking them for tips. Meals somehow become worse. The salted meat softens into a texture you have no vocabulary for. The bread grows damp, and the broth turns into a lukewarm insult. Men poke at their bowls with expressions usually reserved for funerals. You eat anyway, because hunger pays no mind to texture or dignity. Yet, summer also brings strange moments of clarity. In the evenings, when the sun dips low and the shadows stretch across the deck, the air cools just enough that you can breathe without feeling like you are swallowing steam. Men sit quietly at the railing, sweat dried into salty maps on their faces, staring at the shimmering horizon. Their expressions soften, the heat stripping away anger and leaving only exhausted humanity behind. You stand among them, watching the sky turn colors that feel impossibly gentle compared to the day you just survived. For a few minutes, You can almost forget how the Hulk smells, how it feels, how it suffocates. You can almost pretend you are simply a man watching summer drift across the water. And then, night settles in, bringing with it a fresh wave of warmth that coils around your body like a damp serpent, ready to begin the cycle all over again. You know something unusual is happening long before the guards say a word. There is a peculiar energy on deck, a restless stir among the prisoners, the kind that spreads through cramped bodies like static. Men keep glancing toward the gangway, toward the officers pacing with too much purpose, toward the small stack of paperwork clutched in the warden's hands. Even the gulls seem nosier today, circling low as if hoping to witness a spectacle. Then the order is shouted, "Muster for transfer." The words hit the Hulk like a hammer. Conversations stumble into silence. Tools pause mid-lift. Every man stiffens slightly, just enough to betray that tiny spark of fear no one ever admits to. Transfers mean change. Transfers mean uncertainty. Transfers mean you might leave this floating misery for a completely different one. And somehow, the familiar suffering of the Hulk begins to feel almost comforting in comparison. The prisoners gather on deck in uneven lines. The guards stand taller, not out of pride, but out of the need to look like they control a situation even they do not fully trust. The warden unfolds the list with exaggerated slowness, as if savoring the tension he has created. Men shift their weight, each pretending they do not care, each listening with an intensity that tightens their jaw. The first name is called. A man 3 rows ahead of you flinches. His eyes widen, not with joy, not with sorrow, but with the blank confusion of someone who has just been informed. His entire life is being packed into a different box. He steps forward slowly, the chain at his ankles rattling with a sound that feels heavier than metal. 2 guards take hold of his arms and move him aside, neither gently nor cruelly, simply efficiently. More names follow. Some men mutter prayers. Some stare at the deck. One curses softly under his breath, though no one blames him. A transfer could mean land, stone walls, cells with barred windows instead of lower decks that smell of mildew and misery. Or it could mean the voyage to Australia, months at sea, storms, sickness, and the kind of distance that erases a man from the life he once had. When a name is called, the reaction varies. A few men straighten their backs, trying to appear brave, though the twitch around their eyes betrays them. Others look relieved, eager even, convinced that anything must be better than this. Some stare hollowly, too worn down to process the moment, but nearly all share one trait. They pretend this does not terrify them. At one point, the warden calls a name that earns a collective inhale. It is a man known for his biting humor, for laughing at misfortune with the skill of a man who has long made peace with chaos. Now his expression cracks. He steps forward, but his smile slips away, replaced with something fragile. You watch him go, and the deck feels colder for it. No one speaks during the process. The list seems to stretch on forever, each syllable rolling out like a verdict. Transfers remind every man aboard that the Hulk is not a sentence unto itself, but a waiting room for whatever the Empire decides next. You feel it in your bones, that thin thread of uncertainty that binds you all together. When the last name is called, the chosen men are lined near the gangway, shackled but upright. Some stare at the horizon. Some stare at their own feet. One tries to glimpse familiar faces in the crowd, perhaps hoping for a silent farewell. The guards begin moving them toward the boat that waits to ferry them to shore. The chains clatter in uneven rhythm, a sound too final for comfort. You watch them go, realizing how strange it is to envy and pity them in equal measure. They are leaving the Hulk, yes, but they are stepping into a world of possibilities that range from tolerable to nightmarish. You remain behind, tied to this floating purgatory, watching the transferred men shrink into distant figures. As the boat pulls away, the prisoners around you shift back into their routines. The guards shout for order. The warden folds his list. Life on the Hulk resumes, swallowing the moment as though it never happened. But you feel the hollowness left behind by their absence. Bunks will lie empty tonight, Voices will be missing from the evening murmurs. The rhythm of the ship will change. Subtly, but unmistakably, you step away from the railing, knowing that tomorrow will look exactly like yesterday, and knowing too that someday, perhaps sooner or perhaps much later, your own name will be called, and whatever waits on the other side of that moment will be just as terrifying. You know something is wrong long before anyone says it aloud. The man in the bunk across from you has been coughing for days, the kind of cough that rattles deep in the ribs and leaves a faint metallic taste in the air. At first he waved off concern with a tired grin, insisting it was only the cold, or the damp, or the way the air squeezes the lungs down here like it is trying to make room for itself. But last night he barely spoke, slipping into a restless half-sleep punctuated by shallow breaths and long silences that stretched too far. By morning, the entire lower deck feels different. The ship groans the same way it always does, but the men around you move slower, more cautiously, as if they are trying not to disturb something fragile. You sit up and look toward his bunk. He lies still, too still, the blanket rising only a fraction before settling again. Someone calls his name softly. No response. Another tries shaking his shoulder, gently at first, then more firmly. His head rolls with the motion, loose, unresisting. A hush spreads through the row like ink across water. No one panics, no one cries out. Death on the hulk is not rare enough to shock, but not common enough to ignore. It sits in that uncomfortable middle ground where everyone knows what happens next. Yet half of them avoid looking directly at the body out of superstition. You feel your stomach tighten. You did not know him well, but you knew the sound of his laugh, the rhythm of his shuffle, the way he saved crumbs from his bread, as if planning for a future even he did not believe in. A guard is summoned. He arrives with the bored expression of someone who has seen this too many times to muster fresh emotion for it. He checks for a pulse with 2 fingers, waits longer than necessary, then grunts to himself, confirming what everyone already knows. He calls for 2 men to assist. No pleas, no hesitation, just the mechanical voice of duty. The chosen prisoners step forward without argument. They lift the blanket and wrap it around the body with a kind of muted care, adjusting it until the outline of the man beneath is softened, indistinct. You watch their hands as they work. They do not rush, nor do they linger. They have learned the pace expected in these moments, a kind of grim efficiency, built from routine and the quiet understanding that the dead deserve respect even when the living have so little to spare. No prayers are said, no final words offered. The hulk does not encourage rituals beyond those necessary to keep order. The body is lifted, carried down the narrow aisle between bunks, and taken toward the hatch. Men shift aside silently, eyes lowered, making room without being told. You do the same when the body passes you. You cannot help glancing at the blanket, noticing how small it looks in their arms, how light. It is unsettling, this sudden reduction of a man to something that can be carried so easily. They bring him above deck. You follow at a distance, wanting to witness but not wanting to intrude. The morning air hits you with its cold clarity, sharper than usual, as if the world itself is acknowledging the moment. The body is placed near the railing. The guards check a ledger, scratching notes in stiff, practiced strokes. A cart waits on the dock below, hitched to a horse, swishing its tail with utter indifference. When they lower the body into the boat that will ferry it ashore, the hulk watches without expression. The ropes creak, the water ruffles. A gull lands on the railing as though inspecting the proceedings. One prisoner mutters a brief farewell under his breath. Another makes the sign of something on his chest. Quick, embarrassed, hidden from the guards. You stand with your hands curled into fists, unsure whether you are holding in grief or simply holding yourself together. The boat pushes off. The body moves farther away, shrinking into a gray blur. The cart will take him somewhere quiet, somewhere out of sight, to be buried or catalogued or forgotten according to whatever the system demands. No one aboard the hulk will receive news of the grave's location. His name will fade from conversation within weeks, maybe days, absorbed into the ship's endless routine. As you descend back into the lower deck, the air feels heavier. Men settle into their tasks again, because they must, because labor does not pause for morning. Yet the space where he slept feels impossibly empty. His blanket remains folded at the corner, his tin cup still tucked under the bunk. These small remnants vibrate with the strange power of things left behind. Someone else will occupy that berth soon enough. Life in a cage never allows gaps for long. You lie in your own bunk that night, listening to the usual sounds, the dripping, the breathing, the soft murmurs, but beneath them all is a new silence, a hollow note where another life used to be. And for the first time in a while, you understand the full weight of the Hulk's indifference. The ship continues. It always continues. You do not notice the moment adaptation begins. It arrives quietly, without ceremony, settling into your habits like dust gathering in corners. One morning you wake and realize the lower deck no longer feels like an assault. It is still cramped, still sour-smelling, still filled with the snores of men who sleep like wounded bears. But some part of you has stopped reacting to it. Your senses dull just enough to make existence tolerable, not pleasant, never pleasant, but survivable. You start recognizing the exact timbre of each creak in the hull. You know which ones signal harmless shifting and which ones warn that a storm might be wandering toward the harbor. You know which beams drip during the night, and you learn to position your bunk at just the right angle to avoid them. You no longer flinch when someone coughs nearby. You barely blink when a rat scurries along a beam overhead. In fact, you catch yourself judging its route, noting where the wood is thinning. Routines take shape, not imposed by force, but formed naturally, almost unconsciously. You wake before the guard clangs his bell, rolling up from your bunk with the stiff, groaning grace of someone twice your age. You fold your blanket, not because anyone cares about tidiness, but because the ritual steadies your mind. You stretch your arms, loosening joints stiff from cold nights and cramped boards. Sometimes you even manage to enjoy the stillness of those first few minutes, that fragile hush before the ship's noise swells to full volume. Small comforts reveal themselves in strange places. A sliver of morning sunlight slipping through a crack in the hull becomes a treasured sight. The warmth lasts only a few minutes, but you seek it out, lifting your face toward it like a plant starved for light. You discover that the prisoner who sleeps 2 bunks down hums quietly in the evenings, a tune he claims his mother used to sing. It drifts through the lower deck in soft, wavering notes, giving the darkness a gentleness it does not deserve. Even food finds its corner of comfort. The broth never improves, but you learn to appreciate the rare moments when it contains something recognizable as vegetable. Bread remains a weapon disguised as nourishment, yet on days when it is merely hard instead of petrified, you treat it like a gift. Someone trades you a pinch of salt once, a tiny miracle that transforms your entire bowl into something almost edible. You savor it slowly, letting your tongue memorize the taste. The bonds you form with the other prisoners surprise you most. Misery shared becomes a strange glue, binding men together who would never have spoken on the outside. You learn who jokes when they are nervous, who grows quiet when they are angry, who can be trusted to watch your back during labor, and who will absolutely barter your soul for an extra ladle of stew. The unspoken alliances deepen. A man you barely know might hand you a scrap of cloth to wrap your cracked knuckles. Another might shift sideways on the bench, so you have just enough room to sit. No one calls it kindness, but it is. Conversations change too. They drift less toward despair and more toward the mundane details of surviving the week. Someone shares a story from before the Hulk, and another adds his own. The stories blend until you find yourself talking as well, offering fragments of your past, not because you trust the men around you fully, but because the sound of your own voice reminds you that you once lived somewhere else, someone else. Even the guards become predictable. You know which ones yell for sport and which ones only yell when absolutely necessary. You know which ones stomp loudly and which ones sneak up like annoyed cats. You adjust your pace, your posture, your tone, not out of fear anymore, but out of efficiency. You conserve energy, you avoid conflict, not because you are intimidated, but because it wastes hours you cannot spare. You adapt because you have to, because the alternative is losing yourself entirely. The ship still wears you down, grinding the edges of your identity like a stone against metal. But beneath that abrasion, something stubborn remains, a shard of self that refuses to disappear. One evening, lying on your bunk as lantern light sways across the ceiling, you realize you are not fighting the Hulk every moment of every day anymore. You are moving with it, bending around it, carving out a space one breath at a time. It is not victory. It is survival shaped into routine. Hope arrives the way most things do on the Hulk, quietly, suspiciously, wearing a shabby disguise. You first hear it in a whisper pass between two men during the morning muster, something about a new policy, a list being reviewed, a chance that some sentences might be shortened. You dismiss it immediately. Hope on the Hulk usually has the lifespan of a mayfly, but the whisper returns again at midday, drifting from a different corner of the ship, carried by a man who normally refuses to repeat anything he cannot personally swear to. By evening, even the rats seem to pause long enough to listen. You lie on your bunk, staring at the beams above you, replaying the rumors in your mind with the careful skepticism of a man who has been fooled by optimism before. Someone claims the government is reconsidering overcrowding. Another insists a magistrate inspected the Hulk last week and left looking deeply unimpressed. A third swears he overheard a guard muttering about paperwork for early releases. None of these stories line up. All of them contradict each other, yet together they form something that feels fragile and unbearably warm. You try not to show interest. Men who look too hopeful on the Hulk attract the same attention as men who look too wealthy in a gambling den. But the shift in atmosphere is undeniable. The prisoners move with a strange alertness, the kind usually seen in animals that sense a change in weather. Even the guards act differently, responding to questions with less bark and more sigh. One of them, a veteran with an impressive ability to look bored in any situation, actually tells a prisoner to keep his chin up. This is so deeply out of character that you nearly drop the bucket you are carrying. During labor on deck, you catch fragments of conversation between two officers. Their voices carry poorly in the wind, but you hear enough to piece together that someone important has sent a message. Something about numbers, something about reductions, something about the need to shift men out. They speak in clipped tones, clearly annoyed about the extra work such changes would bring. But annoyance means something is happening. Annoyance is better than nothing. That night, the storytelling circle takes on a different tone. The usual tales of ghosts, thieves, and improbable escapes fade into the background, replaced by quiet discussions about what release might look like. One man insists he will find honest work. Another mutters that he will never touch a bar again. A third says he wants nothing more than to sleep in a real bed without listening for drips or footsteps. You sit listening, arms wrapped around your knees, letting the warmth of their hopes seep into your bones. You do not speak your own dream aloud. Speaking it feels dangerous, like handing it to the ship so it can snap it in half. But you think about it intensely. You picture walking on solid ground again, feeling dirt beneath your boots instead of boards that creak in protest. You imagine breathing air that has not been recycled through 200 lungs. You imagine silence not filled with groans and chains, but with wind rustling through trees, with the distant chatter of normal life. The thought swells inside you until it almost hurts. The next morning brings another sign. The warden is in a foul mood, pacing with a stack of papers tucked under his arm and muttering about revisions. Everyone watches him with the same expression, suspicion mixed with a flicker of anticipation. Even the petty tyrant who usually enjoys barking commands seems too preoccupied to harass anyone. He glances at the sky often, like a man expecting news to fall out of the clouds. When the sun sets, you find yourself standing at the railing, staring at the harbor with its glittering lights. You think about all the days you have watched the world move without you. Tonight, though, it feels different, as if the distance is shrinking, as if the water between the hulk and the shore has shifted its tone, no longer cold and impenetrable, but restless, stirring with possibility. Hope is a dangerous thing here. Men have cracked under its weight far faster than they ever broke under despair. You remind yourself of that as you lie back down, pulling your blanket to your chin, listening to the gentle rumble of snores and the soft tapping of rats exploring the beams. But danger or not, the feeling remains. For the first time in a long while, the tide seems to be turning. You know something serious is unfolding the moment the guards start looking nervous. Not angry, not bored, but genuinely nervous. The way men look when someone important is about to arrive and they realize they have not straightened their uniforms since last winter. The hulk feels different too, as if the ship itself has stiffened its planks in anticipation. Word spreads that officials are coming aboard, men with polished boots, clipped accents, and the power to decide who leaves and who stays. By the time you are marched onto the deck, the air hums with a kind of brittle tension. The prisoners stand straighter than usual, some smoothing their shirts, others trying to appear neither too hopeful nor too hopeless. The officials appear soon after, stepping onto the gangway with all the grace of men who believe boards should flatten themselves before their feet. They carry folders, gloves, and expressions that suggest they personally disapprove of moisture, prisoners, and possibly gravity. One man leads the group, his coat crisp, his hair arranged with near military precision. His face is unreadable, a stone slab carved into human shape. The guard beside you whispers that he is the magistrate, though you could have guessed simply by the way he surveys the deck, as if evaluating a stable full of mismatched horses. He opens his ledger with a brisk flick, scanning names, notes, and sentences with the calm disinterest of someone reading ingredients on a jar. You stand in line, heart thudding in a slow, heavy rhythm. It is strange to realize that your future may hinge on the mood of a man who might have had an underwhelming breakfast. Perhaps his tea was too weak. Perhaps his toast burned. Perhaps his wife scolded him before he left. You search his face for clues, but his eyes remain sharp and detached, as though he has spent a lifetime perfecting neutrality for moments exactly like this. He calls the first name. A prisoner steps forward, trembling, offering a small bow that looks more like a stumble. The magistrate asks questions in a clipped tone, barely glancing at the man as he answers. The guard at his side murmurs something, handing over a paper. A decision is made with an impatient notation, and the man is dismissed, either to the left or the right, meaning one future or the other. You cannot tell which is which. You are not sure you want to. The process repeats. One man tries to plead his case, only to be silenced with a raised hand. Another mutters something under his breath, and a guard elbows him sharply. A third stands tall, jaw set, offering answers with the dignity of someone who refuses to shrink, though his hands shake visibly at his sides. The magistrate remains unflinching, his voice steady, his pen scratching neat little fates into the ledger. When he finally calls your name, the world narrows. You step forward, the chains around your ankles clinking loud enough to echo. The magistrate looks at you, not long enough to truly see you, but long enough to assess your posture, your face, perhaps the state of your boots. He asks a question, simple, administrative. You answer with a voice you barely recognize, steady but too dry, as though the words had to scrape their way out. He scans the page bearing your history. A frown flickers across his brow. Not anger, not disgust, something closer to inconvenience. He shifts slightly, adjusting a corner of the ledger, and for a moment you wonder if this tiny act of discomfort bodes ill for you. He asks another question, one that forces you to confront the very reason you are here. You answer without embellishment. Elaborating feels dangerous. Silence feels worse. He watches you just long enough for unease to settle deep in your stomach. Then he nods once to himself and circles something on the page. You try to read his handwriting upside down, but it looks like a bird ran across it with inked feet. He closes the ledger, snaps it shut in a decisive motion, and gestures for you to step aside. That's it. No lecture. No verdict shouted for the crowd. No dramatic flourish. Just a nod that either saves you or damns you. You are led back into the line. The next name is called. You stand there, trying to keep your breath even, trying not to let your mind sprint into the future that has not yet been revealed. Around you, The ship resumes its restless noises. The gulls screech. The waves slap against the hull. Men shift their weight nervously. The officials continue their slow march through each life. Your fate now rests inside a folder held by a man who may or may not be hungry, and there is nothing left to do but wait. Freedom begins not with a grand announcement, but with a guard clearing his throat in that bored, nasal way guards do when they are about to change someone's life. He reads your name without ceremony, without even looking up, as if he is calling for the next man in line at a bakery. For a moment, you assume you misheard. Your mind tries to twist the sound into something safer, something that does not require hope. But then he repeats it, louder, irritated that you did not spring forward like an obedient dog. You rise slowly, your joints stiff from too many nights on planks that have never softened to human weight. The men around you look up. Some offer a small nod, others a faint smile. A few look away entirely, unwilling to watch someone else climb the stairs they may never climb themselves. You do not blame them. Your legs tremble as you move toward the hatch, and you tell yourself it is only the cold. The climb to the main deck feels strangely long, as if each step is resisting you out of habit. You emerge into the light, blinking at a sky that seems impossibly open. The air tastes different up here, sharper, colder, unfiltered by 200 lungs, and the endless damp. A line of guards waits near the gangway, standing with stiff professionalism, though one of them looks almost pleased to be rid of another prisoner. Beyond them, the shore glows with the muted colors of morning. A clerk with ink stains on his cuffs thrusts a paper toward you. He recites your name, your offense, your sentence served, all with the enthusiasm of a man reading ingredients off a soap label. He hands you a document that declares you free, though the word still feels too large to fit inside your chest. You stare at it for a heartbeat, half expecting someone to snatch it back and declare the whole thing a clerical error, but no one does. The guard at the head of the gangway gestures for you to move, his eyebrows raised in a way that says he has no time for existential crises. You take your first step onto the narrow plank connecting the ship to the waiting world. The wood shifts beneath your feet, familiar in its trembling way, but ahead lies something steady, unmoving. You walk slower than necessary, not from fear, but because part of you needs this moment to stretch, to become real. Halfway across, curiosity makes you look back. The hulk looms behind you, the same misshapen mass of timbers and rusted fittings you first boarded what feels like a lifetime ago. Its hull sweats in the morning sun, its windows stare like tired eyes, and its chains creak with their eternal complaint. You swear, just for a breath, that the ship itself seems to exhale, relieved to release one more soul from its shadowed ribs. Perhaps you imagine it. Perhaps the hulk is too old to care, but the sensation lingers. You reach the end of the gangway and step onto solid ground. The earth does not rock beneath you. It does not sigh or groan or shift. It simply holds you. Your knees wobble anyway, accustomed to years of uncertain footing. The scent of dirt rises warm and strange, so different from the heavy brine of the harbor. Men move about the docks with purpose, calling to one another, carrying crates, living lives that have not paused in your absence. Their voices feel almost too loud, too bright. You stand there, feeling both weightless and unbearably heavy. Freedom does not sweep over you all at once. It trickles in slowly, seeping through the cracks the hulk carved into you. You feel it in the breeze brushing your cheek, in the distant laughter of children by the shore, in the simple miracle of ground that does not sway. The document in your hand crinkles as your fingers tighten around it. Behind you, the hulk shifts, releasing a long, tired groan. You know other men are below deck watching your departure, some silently cheering, others quietly mourning their own stalled futures. You wish you could offer them something, a word, a promise. But the hulk keeps its prisoners firmly, even in memory. You owe them more than you can give right now. You take another step away, then another. Each one feels like shedding a layer of shadow. The world ahead is uncertain, complicated, and far larger than the narrow corridors you have known, but it is yours again, even if only in pieces. The past clings to your boots, to your clothes, to your bones, but it no longer holds your direction. You keep walking,